How Pornography and Sex Became a Death Cult. Preface. Why this book is necessary. From libido to thanatos. Introduction. Lost in the pleasure dome. How meaning withers when eros meets the death drive. The shredded innocence. 1. Playground of shadows, infantilized screens, and early radicalization. 2. The corruption of desire, hypersexualized culture as gateway to nihilism. 3. Idols of authenticity. Be yourself when the self is hollow. 2nd. Pornographic prophets. 6. The cult of martyrs, romanticizing self-destruction for clicks and clout. 3rd. The naive rebel. 7. Permission without purpose, liberal liberty stripped of moral ballast. 8. Rebels without roots, adolescence against father and mother, tradition, logos. 9. The carnival of compassion, weaponized empathy and virtue porn. 4th. Rituals of the death drive. Deset. Training the body for sacrifice, from gym selfie to battlefield selfie. 5th. Reclaiming meaning. Trinact. The theology of the body revisited, integrating eros and logos after the fall. Tornact. Pedagogy of reality, teaching metaphysics in a pixelated age. Patnact. The feast of life, communities that celebrate being over nothingness. Epilogue. From abyss to ascent, choosing blessing over curse. Appendices. Glossary of eschatological and psychological terms. And historical case studies, ISIS recruitment, 20th century sex death cults, etc. Unrecommended readings. Addendum. Preface. Why this book is necessary. From libido to thanatos. Western societies today face a profound crisis of meaning. Freedoms once celebrated now feel like disorder without direction. As Douglas Murray and others have observed, liberal democracies have become ever more confident in individual choice, but simultaneously less able to answer the old questions: why live? What do we love or die for? Many young people drift through a world awash in pleasure and information but devoid of purpose. In this vacuum, two ancient impulses, eros, the life-affirming drive, and thanatos, the death-seeking drive, have become dangerously entangled. Hypersexualized culture offers endless stimulation, however empty, while apocalyptic ideologies offer dramatic sacrifice, however destructive. The urgency of our time is that a generation is coming of age starved for meaning, and when everything is for sale or negotiable, they are all too ready to fill the void with anything, even with despair or zealotry. Eros unbound, hypersexual, culture and emptiness. One striking symptom is the ubiquity of erotic content. Pornography and casual sex have ceased to be fringe, and instead saturate everyday life. Many youths learn to equate intimacy with consumption, but research shows this leaves them spiritually and emotionally hollow. For example, among young adults who use online porn daily, nearly 1/3 report feeling down, depressed, or hopeless most of the time, versus fewer than 1/5 of those who rarely or never watch it. Daily porn users also report loneliness far more often than their peers. In other words, constant sexual stimulation without deeper connection tends to co-occur with anxiety, depression, and alienation. This is no coincidence. Psychologists note that compulsive consumption of artificial sexual stimuli can warp expectations, create obsessive patterns, and starve the psyche of genuine affection. In effect, the life drive becomes enslaved by empty ritual, leaving a kind of spiritual hangover. To see how these trends interact with other currents, consider some symptoms of the present culture. An hypersexualization as commodity, pornography and hookup culture teach that sex is a transaction and a thrill, not a bond. Young people are constantly exposed to graphic, often violent sexual imagery that treats human bodies like objects to be used. This dehumanizing consumption dulls the soul and disconnects erotic desire from love or community. Relativism and my truth. In tandem, moral relativism has taken root. Major surveys find a majority of today's teens believe you can be a good person without any objective standard, even without God. If all values are said to be personal, young minds struggle to distinguish true conviction from emotional fashion. They may affirm every cause in turn, yet find none to which they are truly devoted. And spectacle and narcissism, social media and consumerism encourage constant comparison and self-promotion. Approval is measured in likes and follows. But these likes do not build virtue or wisdom. They cultivate emptiness. Indeed, an astonishing 1 in 5 U.S. adolescents now reports symptoms of anxiety and depression. By 2019, the share of teens diagnosed with depression had roughly doubled over a decade. A torrent of stimuli that promises fulfillment instead breeds isolation. Identity without roots, with tradition and community ties weakened, youths often lack a firm identity. They may latch onto consumer brands or online tribes, but these too feel hollow. Absent a transcendent narrative, many embrace anything that promises meaning, even if it glorifies destruction. Together, these forces unleash a dangerous confusion between eros and thanatos. The same culture that celebrates freedom and pleasure can leave a youth feeling empty and purposeless, primed to embrace nihilistic alternatives. Without firm moral anchors, young people may begin to view life itself as absurd or transactional, a view that plays directly into death-driven ideologies. Nihilism, in the heart of liberty. Meanwhile, the liberal erosion of moral anchors has heightened the drift toward nihilism. Pluralism and secularism were meant to foster tolerance, but in practice many youths today have lost touch with any belief stronger than personal preference. In one Pew survey, 61% of American teens said it isn't necessary to believe in God in order to be moral. Similar polls find most young people assume truth is relative to one's feelings or identity. In a society where every narrative may be treated as equally valid, a curious thing happens. A single secular gospel, for example, about climate catastrophe or identity revolution, can start to function as a dogma. Teens are told respect everyone's truth, yet simultaneously that this particular vision is the only righteous one. The dissonance is dizzying. This modern relativism can act like a kind of hypnosis. People repeat slogans or outrage without analysis. Under its spell, conscience and nuance are overridden by certitude. The great 20th century thinker Hannah Arendt warned of exactly this danger. When individuals surrender wholly to an ideology's iron logic, they lose their ability to think for themselves. They become instruments of a higher will, marching toward destruction with smiles on their faces. This is a living death of the spirit, a fate as dire as any physical threat. At the same time, traditional sources of meaning like family, faith, or civic rituals are weakened. In many communities, the old landmarks have fallen away. What remains is a diffuse, shifting landscape of competing subcultures. Some young people retreat into endless entertainment or self-help as distraction. Others turn inward with despair. And a growing number reach outward, seeking certainty and belonging, sometimes by signing on to radical narratives that promise a cosmic purpose. The allure of apocalyptic ideologies. This is where Thanatos enters most dangerously. The Deathcult ideologies that woo disillusioned youth with dramatic, often apocalyptic visions. When ordinary life feels meaningless, an extreme cause can seem heroic. We see this in many quarters. Some young people have been drawn into violent extremism, while others, on the opposite end, have embraced cult-like utopianism or conspiratorial paranoia. Whether it's militant groups promising global jihad, or totalitarian utopias rooted in race and class warfare, or even self-destructive online subcultures, the pattern is similar. In each case, an ideology offers a story of cosmic struggle and sacrifice, the universe's great finale, to replace the yawning silence of consumer life. Contemporary research on radicalization underscores this psychological dynamic. Psychologists note that youth who feel chronically excluded are hungry for affiliation. If they can't find it in normal society, extremist groups step in as a form of social resurrection. The global reach of the internet ensures that any disaffected young person can hear doomsday narratives tailored for them. Exploiting fears of apocalypse, literal or symbolic, these narratives frame suicide or mass violence as meaningful revolt. It is a perverse fulfillment of the death drive, fighting the end of days by becoming harbingers of destruction. Yet this descent is not inevitable. Even at the darkest moments, the haunting words of Dostoevsky and Arendt remind us that the soul still matters. The tragedy of the fanatic, Arendt wrote, is that a person's mind is colonized by dogma, and their soul is fed into the ideological machine. But if we truly believe in human dignity, then nothing about a captive mind is beyond redemption, towards redemption and renewal. The gravity of our situation demands action, not just analysis. That is why this book is necessary. We will rigorously examine how liberal liberalism and hyper-individualism have unwittingly created a platform for cultural despair. We will unpack how the bombardment of empty pleasures and relative truths can drive a generation toward disaffection or fanaticism. At the same time, we refuse to resign ourselves to tragedy. Drawing on history, philosophy, psychology, and theology, we will explore frameworks for renewal. How can eros be retamed and reinvested with honor, rather than degraded into numbness? How can we recover a sense that some values are truly universal, even in a pluralist world? How can we rebuild the social and spiritual bonds that give life meaning so that youths no longer feel isolated or expendable? Social scientists themselves suggest one answer: community and purpose are the antidotes to radicalization. Studies emphasize social reintegration, connecting young people to real community, civic life, and tradition, as the most powerful preventive against the allure of death-driven ideologies. This implies re-enchanting parts of our world, finding awe in art, wonder in nature, solidarity in service to others, and humility in the face of mysteries larger than ourselves. It means teaching youths that life's value does not lie in continuous self-stimulation or the perverse thrill of destruction, but in love, sacrifice, and even faith in something greater. The journey from libido to thanatos is a long one, but not one we must complete. In these pages we will trace its contours and confront its shadows. We will also seek the opposite path, the way back to life with full consciousness and hope. The tone is urgent because the stakes are high, the very hearts and minds of our young people. Yet it is also hopeful. By understanding the depth of our cultural illness, we give ourselves a chance to seek genuine healing. Ultimately, we believe a healthier society can emerge, one that tempers freedom with responsibility, passion with purpose, and passion with love. This book is a call to face the truth of our times with courage and clarity. It is a call to preserve the soul of a generation before it is lost. And it is a call to rebuild the moral and spiritual foundations that once made freedom not just possible, but meaningful. Introduction. Lost in the pleasure dome. How, meaning withers when eros meets the death drive, the pleasure dome. In a dream-shimmering reverie, youth wander through a vast pleasure dome built of light and shadow. Screens flare with a kaleidoscope of seductions, endless images and urgings pulling the soul in every direction. At first it feels like liberation, a Xanadu of our own making, but as the haze deepens, a sinister hunger lurks behind every smile. The air grows thick with a slow doom, quiet longing for something more, a fear we cannot yet name. In this hall of mirrors, the original fire of meaning flickers and grows distant, stolen by images of endless pleasure that promise joy but deliver only hollow echoes of the self. The lies of the age. Our age speaks in sweet and poison-tipped lies, blurring reality into illusion. As Hannah Arendt warned, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is someone for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, between true and false, no longer exists. Today's youth are likewise inundated by false idols and platitudes masquerading as truth, so that moral boundaries dissolve into relativism. We are told that every desire is sacred and every feeling true, that endless freedom lies in pursuing pleasure at any expense. Yet this libertine creed is a snare. One critic notes that under the reckless abandon of moral relativism, the false promise of freedom ensnares its seekers, making them slaves, to sin leading to death. In other words, the liberation we crave has become a new bondage, a beautiful lie luring us toward destruction, eros, libido, and the death drive. Beneath these surface deceptions, deeper forces wrestle in the human psyche. Freud taught that alongside our instinct for life and pleasure, eros, lurks an equally powerful death drive, thanatos. In his words, the psyche seeks to return to a prior inanimate state, as if the aim of life is death. In parallel, Carl Jung described the libido not merely as raw sex drive, but as psychic energy or life force propelling spiritual and creative growth. Our youth carry this libidinal energy like a sacred spark. It longs to build, to reach toward truth, to grow. But when culture corrupts that spark with distorted images of pleasure or despair, the arrows within them can be turned inward to fuel emptiness and self-destruction instead. Thus, the divine spark of love and creativity is twisted into a revolt against life, and the innocent yearnings of the soul feed the void. Sacrilegious carnival. What was meant to be a sacrament becomes a sacrilege. Consider how pornography and hypersexual media serve as a grim altar where the libido is defiled. One analysis of 304 popular pornographic films found that 88% depicted men physically assaulting women, a brutal choreography masquerading as desire. Children stumble into this darkness early. The average age for first exposure to porn is only 11, after which that destructive seed is nurtured and grows into something destructive. In these idolatries of the flesh, girls are objectified, and boys are trained to equate love with dominance. Every click and glance deepens a secret corruption, and young hearts are unknowingly baptized into this death cult of empty lust. Dionysian ecstasy. Dionysus, the ancient god of wine and ecstasy, illustrates the paradox. He promised to free his followers from all care and fear, yet he demanded their complete surrender. According to myth, Dionysus's wine, music, and ecstatic dance would free his followers from self-conscious fear and care, but anyone who partook of his mysteries became possessed by his will. Today we live in a bacchanal, not of grain and vines but of pixels and sensations. We are enticed by digital Dionysia, festivals of flesh and fantasy that promise intoxication but deliver possession. The sacred energy of sexuality, meant to bind us to love and to life, is instead converted into a pawn of the cult of pleasure. In this sacrilege, the libido that should lead upward is dragged into a rout of oblivion, each orgasm a small death of meaning. Death cults and eschaton. Meanwhile, a darker carnival marches just beneath the surface. Sects and ideologues celebrate annihilation as a new ecstasy. As Douglas Murray observes, some groups are driven by a death cult ideology that openly glorifies martyrdom and seeks destruction. Whether robed in nationalist fever or cloaked as radical liberation, these beliefs groom youth to welcome their own erasure and the collapse of others. Even popular culture overflows with eschatology, an almost mystical obsession with apocalypse and final judgment. In fact, the word eschatology literally means the study of the last things, the end of the age or the world itself. We devour tales of global doom and cataclysmic rebirth, as if our culture itself were a fragile manuscript burning at both ends. But any ideology that preaches the end of truth and the coming of annihilation is itself a death knell for the soul, the awakening of the soul. Caught in these whirlpools of lust and doom, the flame of meaning dimly flickers. Arendt reminds us of the crucial measure for our time. Every idea and movement must be judged by whether it serves life or tyranny, whether it binds us closer to each other or reduces us to bundles of reactions. As she argued, the truest yardstick is simply this: does it serve freedom or domination? If eros, the force of life, love, creativity, is channeled into anything less than growth and truth, it withers. The Faustian bargains of endless pleasure and noble death ultimately leave us bankrupt of meaning. Only by recognizing these deceptions, by naming the idols they worship, can we hope to reclaim the sacred energy of youth. In the coming chapters we will trace these shadows more deeply, unmasking false gods, exploring forgotten myths, and searching out the living truth beneath the ruins of the pleasure dome. The journey must be urgent, for without it, our children will wander eternally lost in Xanadu, a pleasure dome turned mausoleum for the soul. Chapter 1. The Shredded. Innocence. Playground of shadows, infantilized screens, and early radicalization. In the cradle of the digital age, screens have become surrogate mothers. Children clutch tablets instead of dolls, and lullabies are replaced by the glow of pixelated play. Astonishingly, half of all teenagers report feeling addicted to their devices. The typical adolescent now picks up and checks a phone roughly 50 times a day, using it as a security blanket and escape. Indeed, over 2/3 of 11 to 17-year-olds admit they find it difficult to stop using technology, often turning to it to flee sorrow or anxiety. What was once innocence, the wild, noisy play of children, is replaced by a digital playpen of endless stimulation. By design, these infantilizing screens pacify young minds and stunt their growth. In this way, our society has outsourced nurture to gadgets, and the very notion of childhood agency is eroded under the constant bickering of short attention spans. Yet while screens lull our youth into lethargy, they simultaneously prepare young souls for ideological capture. Adolescence is a turbulent time of identity search and vulnerability, and research shows it is precisely this unsettled period that extremist movements exploit. Scholars note that this identity crisis has consistently been identified as a key driver for violent radicalization. In practice, social media platforms and youth movements promise safety, inclusion, or moral clarity, only to channel fledgling minds toward rigid narratives. Studies confirm that personal uncertainty and a negative outlook, hallmarks of an anxious teenager, readily feed into radicalization when stirred by social networks and charismatic influencers. In other words, a childlike dependency nurtured by endless screen-friendly affirmation is all too easily redirected into zealous devotion. Under the guise of inclusion or cause, our innocents are gently coaxed into ideological liturgies. The digital playground has become a shadowy training ground where the fettered mind is offered belonging as bait. A seed of corruption sown while the child still clings to a pacifier. The corruption of desire, hyper-sexualized culture as gateway to nihilism. As spiritual and mystical frameworks erode, our youth are left roaming a desert of desire. Once, love and beauty were guided by sacred story and ritual. Now, erotic longing drifts untethered amid a hyper-modern feast. Without a transcendent North Star, desire becomes a blind hunger. In practice, this means that the liberation of sexuality has morphed into an oppressive spectacle. Girls and boys alike are bombarded with images that reduce eros to commodity, leaving even the promise of pleasure hollow. The American Psychiatric Association observes that this constant sexual objectification damages young souls, for girls especially, pervasive hypersexualized. Media correlates with chronic anxiety about appearance, deep shame, disordered eating, low self-esteem, and clinical depression. What was meant to be freedom to explore identity instead begets confusion and self-loathing. Meanwhile, every other appetite is fed to grotesque excess. We live in the age of infinite choice, infinite porn, infinite fashion, infinite pop sensations, and yet abundance has bred paralysis. Social science confirms that overconsumption is not balm but poison. In one study, youths who placed great value on wealth and possessions were found to be more likely to suffer depression and social isolation than their less materialistic peers. As a Northwestern psychologist put it, people who equate success with accumulating stuff are not happier. In fact, they become more withdrawn and anxious. For our children, a world awash in sensual and material options only deepens the void. Every choice feels overwhelming, and every satisfaction is fleeting. With a global supermarket of delights at their fingertips, the greatest hunger becomes a hunger for meaning, and that appetite is never filled. The result is a spiritual blackout. When eros is severed from any sacred purpose, all that is left is ennui and despair. Desire without direction collapses into a treadmill. Of vacuous gratification, each orgasm or purchase spikes the pleasure centers, then fades into emptiness. In the end, the metaphysical wound is self-inflicted. By feasting on idols of pleasure alone, young hearts find only nihilistic hunger. This generation has been raised with the illusion that every fantasy is within reach, but without the ancient guardrails of ritual and mystery, every dream slips away as smoke, and the soul is left wandering a meaningless void. Idols of authenticity, be yourself when the self is hollow. In the marketplace of modern ideology, authenticity is hailed as the supreme virtue. Yet it is precisely this dogma that hollows out the individual. We are told to be true to ourselves, to become our own authors. But in a neoliberal world, this command becomes a trap. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han observes that under capitalism every person becomes the producer of themselves, turning the self into a marketable commodity. In his words, authenticity is ultimately the self's neoliberal form of production. Authenticity is a selling point. In practice, every selfie and personal brand becomes another product to hawk. This compulsive self-production fuels a narcissistic compulsion, a frantic comparison of oneself against others, until the genuine self is lost. Authenticity, once heralded as freedom from outside dictation, has transformed into a relentless dictatorship of the ego. Charles Taylor articulates the same paradox. Contemporary consumer culture glorifies a unique self whose realization is life's highest meaning. In this view, each individual is thought of as having a unique self, and that finding and realizing this self constitutes the very meaning of life. The catch, Taylor notes, is that this authentic self must now be entirely autonomous, stripped of parents, traditions, even religious authority. However, that autonomy is an illusion. In practice, identity becomes hollow, without external reference. We carve out personhood through brands and causes, and then scream for it to be heard. Our souls starve for recognition. Only that which is expressed and validated by others feels real. Hence, social media's grip and the cult of the selfie. Even progressive movements contribute to this hollowing. Performative identity rituals and virtue signaling become rites of passage, leaving the inner self unnoticed in the crowd. The result is a generation of specters masquerading as people. Liberated from tradition and saturated in consumerism, individuals find their depths amputated. Under competition and commodification, the soul vanishes. A child raised believing be yourself becomes an entrepreneur of a persona, constantly on display, forever drained by self-scrutiny. In this mad career of authenticity, the only real reward is applause, and when it stops, the self evaporates. The soul, that singular other within, is replaced by empty echoes. We stand before the idols of authenticity. I am original, I am unique, only to discover that in the marketplace the self has already been sold away. In the end, the hollow individual is left, clutching slogans and garments of identity, wondering where the true person has gone. Chapter 2: Pornographic. Prophets, algorithms of arousal, data-driven lust as catechism. In the modern divide between flesh and screen, a new catechism is preached in pixels. The faithful sit in dark rooms bathed in blue light, slack-jawed and impotent before a glowing altar of desire. Algorithms whisper seductive sermons, each recommended video, each infinite scroll, training the mind like a religious litany. Pornography has become algorithm-driven, its AI high priests warping what the faithful are exposed to and even altering their very preferences. In this digital liturgy, lust is the doctrine and sexual pleasure the sacrament. The result is a generation catechized by code, with lust as their lesson and orgasm as their amen. Yet orgasm in this context is more than a mere moment of pleasure. It is a spiritual transaction, a soul contract sealed in climax. Whether volitionally or in unwitting surrender, with each orgasm the individual's path is aligned toward forces of either submission or sovereignty. In one path, the pleasure is hollow, isolating, a contract of submission that hands over one's will to compulsion and digital puppeteers. This is the path of the slave. As Aldous Huxley presaged, as political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends, correspondingly, to increase. It will help to reconcile the people to the servitude which is their fate. In the other path, through awareness and intention, orgasm can affirm personal sovereignty, a conscious covenant of love, creation, and self-mastery. The difference lies in awareness, for in metaphysical terms awareness defines salvation. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, warns the biblical prophet, and here the lack of self-knowledge turns a gift of life into an instrument of bondage. A mind lulled into unawareness by algorithmic lust can hardly grasp its own chains. Beneath this struggle churns a reservoir of spiritual power. Sexual energy is creative energy, the very libido that Carl Jung saw shaping art and culture, the life force many traditions revere. Thus, those who control the sexual narrative steer the spirit of an age. There are spirits human and beyond, that influence global direction via sexual and spiritual energy, corporate entities, political ideologues, even mythic archetypes that ride the waves of human desire. In the unseen realm, ancient tempters rejoice as another youth is hooked on infinite porn, pouring their creative fire into a black mirror. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places, says Scripture, reminding us that carnal battles are always also cosmic battles. The more our sexual energy is corrupted or drained by base indulgence, the easier the rulers of darkness steer the collective soul. Consider the zeitgeist, a world drenched in erotic stimuli yet starved of true intimacy, eros unleashed without logos, that is, passion without wisdom. Such a world is easily swayed, its youth spiritually malleable. In ages past, empires and cults alike exploited orgiastic rites to bind followers. Today, big tech and big porn play similar roles, wielding data-driven lust to keep the masses pliant and enthralled. The new prophets of pleasure promise freedom but deliver servitude, as the soul that gives itself over to unbridled arousal slowly forgets the taste of freedom. Orgasm, meant as a little death of the ego and a resurrection of connection, instead becomes a ritual of self-forgetfulness, a momentary annihilation of awareness that cements the catechumen's loyalty to the digital cult. Eschatological erotica, fantasy, sex stitched to apocalyptic longing. In a culture of instant gratification, an undercurrent of thanatos, a death drive, flows just beneath the glossy surface of pleasure. Modern hedonism and hypersexual fantasy, far from quenching our deeper thirst, often feed a subconscious apocalyptic longing. The satiated emptiness after indulgence can curdle into a desire to see it all burn. Thus we witness a perplexing convergence, from the nihilistic corners of left-wing cultural movements to the fanatic ranks of groups like Hamas. There emerges a shared eschatological structure, a fevered longing for destruction or submission to a future fantasy. The libertine secularist and the zealous fundamentalist both envision a radical end to the current world, albeit in different guises. One fantasizes about a purified utopia, or even simply an escape from perceived meaninglessness. The other about a divinely ordained paradise after a holy war, either to destroy it all like a death cult, or to the extent necessary. Both, however, are willing to sacrifice the present world on the altar of their imagined future. As one scholar of millennial movements notes, such true believers see themselves as agents of massive destruction that clears the way for the coming of heaven on earth. Whether the heaven is a classless society, a climate-restored earth, a caliphate, or an afterlife with virgins, the pattern is the same: destroy the world to save it or not, rendering the left-wing woman like the whore of Babylon, either knowingly or unknowingly. Left-wing cultural revolutions, even when secular, often borrow unconsciously from religious end-times mythology. Utopian ideologies commonly carry eschatological belief. The idea that an apocalyptic rupture, violent revolution, systemic collapse is inevitable to usher in perfection. History grimly illustrates how these fantasies turn out. While putatively seeking universal harmony and justice, utopianism has left a tragic trail of death and devastation, sacrificing individual lives on the altar of collective purity, as one commentator observed. The French Revolution's guillotine, the fervor of Marxist revolutions, all promised a new world after a purging fire, an orgiastic release of destruction to birth a new order. Likewise, today's extreme cultural movements sometimes revel in rhetoric of tearing down everything, burn it all. Down being a rallying cry, in hopes that from the ashes their ideals will arise. It is a secular auto-da-fe, a purging fire as sacrament. The lack of spiritual awareness, lack of true knowledge, ensures the cycle repeats. For as it was said in Hosea, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Unawareness and shallow emotional fervor make fertile soil for death cult realities in both political and religious spheres. The youth enthralled by Instagram revolutions, chanting slogans without grasping historical nuance, and the young jihadist reciting scripture without understanding mercy, are kindred spirits in ignorance. Each participates in rituals of pleasure or rage without seeing the puppet strings of unseen powers. Even the realm of sexual fantasy itself has been woven into this apocalyptic tapestry. In a dark paradox, orgasm becomes an energetic rite through which death-obsessed ideologies are both birthed and shielded. In French, the orgasm is tellingly called la petite mort, the little death, hinting at the spiritual release and momentary ego death it brings. In a healthy context, this little death can be a gate to rebirth, a transcendent loss of self that bonds lovers or even opens mystical awareness. But in the context of ubiquitous pornographic fantasy, it can instead serve as a portal for destructive energies. With each unthinking climax to violent or degrading imagery, a seed of death is planted in the psyche. The idea that pleasure is divorced from life and creation, tied instead to emptiness and contempt. This is orgasm as a sacrament of nihilism. It births death and fear-based ideologies by normalizing them in the most intimate recesses of the mind. For instance, the fantasy of domination and submission in sex may translate to an acceptance of domination and submission in politics and society. A generation numb to genuine intimacy may long for extremes to feel anything at all, even the adrenaline of a crisis or the dark romance of an apocalypse. In this way, private fantasies can midwife public nightmares. At the same time, the ecstasy of orgasm shields these burgeoning death cults from scrutiny. Pleasure is a potent anesthetic. Who suspects that their personal indulgence is empowering insidious forces? The ritual seems personal, even trivial, a lone individual lost in pleasure. But consider, the extremist promised 72 virgins in paradise if he martyrs himself. essentially weaponizing a sexual fantasy to sanctify mass murder. Or the average person, drained by chronic porn use, grows indifferent to real-world evil as long as they have their next fix of pleasure. In both cases, the pursuit of bliss insulates the conscience from awakening. As long as the orgasm, whether metaphorical and anticipated utopia or literal and nightly habit, remains the focal point, the spiritual forces of death can operate unchecked behind the scenes. This dynamic is why ignorance coupled with pleasure rituals is so dangerous. The individual feels fulfilled for a moment and sees no need to question deeper realities. Thus are fear-based ideologies birthed under the cover of darkness and bliss, shielded by the very ecstasy that should have been a source of light. The prophetic warning stands without knowledge. Without awareness, the people perish, even as they chase orgasmic heavens that lead them to hell. The cult of martyrs. Romanticizing self-destruction for clicks and clout. Extending these patterns into the digital theater of the 21st century, we witness the rise of a new cult, a cult of martyrs for the social media age. Here, martyrdom isn't always literal death, though it can be. It is the romanticization of self-destruction, whether through emotional suffering, ideological self-sabotage, or physical exploitation, all repackaged for consumption. In a time when attention is currency, sacrifice itself has been commodified. Youth culture, in particular, has developed a morbid aesthetic of beautiful suffering, a perverse glamour around being broken. On TikTok, Instagram, Tumblr, and beyond, suffering is portrayed as beautiful, depression as poetic. A melancholic photo of a tear-streaked face with the caption "broken but beautiful" can garner thousands of likes. Entire subcultures encourage self-harm as an artistic statement, sharing images of wounds and dolorous quotes, actively celebrating despair. Psychologists warn that this glorification of suicide and self-harm creates a copycat effect. Pain becomes performance, and the lines between genuine cry for help and edgy trend blur. For many young people, darkness becomes an identity. My sadness is my art, they declare, and indeed studies find that glamorizing mental illness causes individuals to fuse their identity with their suffering, making recovery frightening, for healing would mean losing the persona they crafted. In this digital cult, to heal is to betray the aesthetic. The martyr must continue to bleed to remain relevant. Parallel to this is the romanticization of ideological self-destruction. Across campuses and online forums, a generation of activists burn with the desire to be sacrificial heroes of their causes. They adopt a martyr's posture, sometimes literally risking career, relationships, even life, for the clout of being society's savior or victim, whichever garners more attention. There is an intoxicating high in publicly shaming oneself for privilege, or in courting persecution for speaking out. Even extremist militants feed into this narrative. Jihadist propaganda, for example, carefully crafts a heroic aesthetic around martyrdom, with videos and posters of young fighters posing as if in some gruesome romance novel of war. They turn death into the ultimate performance. As one historian noted, movements like Hamas embrace a cult of death in which dying for the cause is the pinnacle of achievement. Disturbingly, some disaffected youth in the West look at this imagery and do not recoil. Instead, they transpose it onto their own feelings of alienation. The sight of someone so committed that they'd sacrifice their life lends a warped inspiration. It is edgy, it is countercultural, and thus it seeps into the nihilistic corners of internet culture. In meme forums and radical Twitter circles, jihadist chic and communist revolution chic intermingle with ironic detachment, all romanticizing the idea of total sacrifice, if not to God, then to history, or simply to chaos. Perhaps nowhere is the commodification of sacrifice more literal than in the realm of online sexual influencing. Platforms like OnlyFans invite young people to martyr their own bodies and privacy for money and clout. With the promise of quick riches and adoration, countless youths, disproportionately young women, offer up their flesh on the digital altar, branding it as empowerment. But behind the carefully filtered selfies lies often a story of isolation, pressure, and pain. Research shows that creators on such platforms frequently suffer loneliness, anxiety, depression, shame, and low self-esteem as a result of treating their sexuality as a product. The transactional nature of this sex work seeps into their everyday lives, eroding their sense of self. They become both the priest and the sacrifice in a one-person temple of commerce, performing intimate acts not for genuine connection, but for the appeasement of subscribers and the algorithm. Many find they have little control over their fate, The platform itself demands more content under threat of obscurity, effectively commanding, sacrifice more, or be cast out. Some are even literally under the control of abusive managers or traffickers, their martyrdom coerced. Even absent overt abuse, the mental health toll is clear. When over a third of creators report severe negative outcomes like fear and shame, we must ask, is this empowerment or ritualized self-exploitation? The smile in the photos might be real, but so are the tears outside the frame. Influencer culture at large, even beyond explicit sexual content, runs on a similar logic of sacrifice. The influencer martyr gives up privacy, peace, and often ethics for the cause of constant engagement. Personal struggles and traumas become content to be monetized. We see vloggers publicly self-flagellating for past mistakes to gain sympathy, or conversely, oversharing every breakdown and breakup to feed the content machine. Burnout is rampant. By their own admission, 78% of influencers have suffered mental breakdowns from the relentless pressure. I'm posting daily and sacrificing countless nights to keep up. I missed irreplaceable moments with family, one content creator laments, realizing too late the true cost of chasing virality. In this economy of attention, the algorithm is a Moloch, a pagan god demanding ever greater sacrifice. And like Moloch of old, it consumes the youth most eagerly. We use the word feed for social media feeds, and indeed the feed is fed by the life force of creators and viewers alike, their time, their mental health, their very souls poured into an unending stream of posts. The result is a generation performing a passion play of self-immolation for an audience that clicks like. In this cult of martyrs, to suffer publicly is to prove one's authenticity. Humiliation becomes a currency, reality TV, viral apology videos, and authentic pain a badge of honor. The tragedy, of course, is that this cult offers no redemption. Unlike true martyrs who died for eternal truths, these digital martyrs die a little each day for nothing more than analytics and fleeting applause. The spiritually rich core of sacrifice, the idea of laying down one's life for friends, for love, for God, is inverted into a hollow spectacle. A young woman sells her body not to save her family, but to buy Prada and validation. A young man flirts with extremist violence not to free his people, but to live out a power fantasy and post the manifesto online. It is all performance, no substance, a grotesque parody of martyrdom. And yet, it holds our youth in thrall because it speaks to their deep hunger for meaning in a world that has sold off meaning piece by piece. The system has taught them to seek significance through extremes. If you cannot be loved, be pitied. If you cannot create, destroy. If you cannot live with dignity, at least die infamously. The task of any who resist this cult is to unmask these pornographic prophets and death-driven Pied Pipers. We must show that self-destruction is not salvation, that no number of retweets will fill the God-shaped hole in the heart. The spiritual corruption of the youth via sexual exploitation, digital conditioning, and ideological subversion can be reversed only by rekindling a sense of the sacred. The erotic must be reunited with the ethical, pleasure with presence, activism with wisdom, sacrifice with true love. Until then, the false prophets of lust and doom will continue to recruit acolytes with the glow of the screen and the siren song of an easy apocalypse. A generation hangs in the balance, choosing between oblivion and awakening. The choices made in the bedroom, on the browser, in the chat room, and in the streets are all connected. Each click, each climax, each post can either tighten the chains of the soul or help snap them. The difference, as always, comes down to awareness, to seeing through the enticing veil and recognizing the spiritual realities at play. For those who do, the spell is broken. For those who don't, the pornographic prophets of our age remain false saviors leading their flock over the cliff's edge, one ecstatic step at a time. Chapter 3. The Naive. Rebel. 3:1. Permission without purpose. Liberal liberty stripped of moral ballast. There is a freedom that liberates, and there is a freedom that untethers. Modern liberalism promised the latter without understanding the cost. It has given permission for everything, but guidance for nothing. In the name of individual liberty, every value became optional, every truth became personal, and all constraints were cast away. Society pried loose the moral ballast that once steadied the ship of the soul, thinking this would let it soar. Not foreseeing that unballasted, the ship would drift aimlessly and capsize in the first storm. At first, the new liberty felt like a triumph. No authorities to obey, no doctrines to restrain desire. just an open horizon of choices. But permission without purpose is a hollow gift. When all is allowed, nothing has meaning. A generation raised to recognize nothing as definitive, acknowledging no higher truth or fixed point of reference, ends up adrift in relativism. They were told they could define their own values, yet were given no answer why one value should be chosen over another. Thus the great collapse of meaning began. If life is only about choosing, with no compass to guide choice, how can anything matter? If God is dead, and we have killed him, as Nietzsche's madman lamented, what festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent, to fill the void of purpose? Having cut the anchor that once grounded them, the liberated self now floats in a vacuum of its own making. In this culture of radical liberty, every boundary was a burden to be lifted. Restraint was branded oppression, transgression became a virtue. The individual ego, unencumbered by any duty to family, faith, or community, proclaimed itself sovereign. But a self without limits does not become a god, it becomes a ghost. With no moral or metaphysical structure to inhabit, the self begins to unravel. First comes euphoria, the thrill of rebellion and indulgence. But soon follows the inner dissolution, anxiety, aimlessness, and quiet despair as the soul realizes it is free in an abyss. A permissive society can slide into extremes because there is no center of gravity to restrain it. One person's freedom becomes another's trauma. One group's right is another's ruin. In the absence of shared purpose, each will to power pushes to the extreme. We see it in the wild oscillations of culture, tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine. One day chasing radical individualism, the next day collapsing into tribalism, but never finding balance. When permission is divorced from higher purpose, license devours meaning. The youth, especially, tasting absolute freedom for the first time, find that nothing is forbidden, but also that nothing is revered. They have limitless choices and bottomless appetites, yet suffer a famine of significance. In losing any external guidance for what to do with their freedom, they turn inward and find only confusion. All goals seem arbitrary, all values interchangeable. The result is often paralysis, a kind of existential indecision where any path could be taken but none compels, so life stutters in place. Or else, in desperation for some direction, they lurch toward destructive passions and pseudo-meanings, ideologies of anger, cults of novelty, addictions and obsessions. As one observer noted, the first effect of not believing in God is to believe in anything. When no true north remains, false stars will do. Superstition and conspiracy, nihilism and fanaticism, these rush in to fill the vacuum. A society that declares everything is permitted learns too late that nothing is cherished. And so the culture spirals into chaos and breakdown. Without a moral foundation, liberty loses its light and becomes a flickering torch in the darkness, casting strange shadows. What was meant to empower ends up enslaving. Freedom to choose turns into inability to commit. Tolerance for all turns into cynicism towards all. Apathy and rage alternate in the unmoored soul. Apathetic because nothing seems to matter. Enraged because the heart still craves meaning and finds only frustration. The extreme of permissiveness begets the extreme of despair. In the public sphere, norms and institutions fracture under the strain of constant negation. When each person is a law unto themselves, community itself disintegrates. There is no common vision to bind. Neighbors together, only competing wills. The social fabric unravels into individual threads, easily tangled and torn. We see the symptoms everywhere: families broken, institutions distrusted, discourse devolved into noise. This is the harvest of liberty devoid of telos. It is a freedom that burned its own house down for warmth, leaving a whole generation out in the cold. In the beginning of this journey, the prose was orderly, like the promises of progress and liberation that seemed so clear. But now those sentences crumble, syntax faltering as thoughts disintegrate into the very chaos they describe. Freedom, they cried, freedom from everything. And now everything is free, unhinged, free-falling. The prophetic order has given way to a poetic disorder, a broken mirror reflecting a broken spirit. No anchor, no horizon, no up or down. The words themselves, ves fracture. Permission, purpose, perdition. In the end, the unballasted ship does not sail, it keels over. In the end, the culture of permission without purpose collapses under its own weight. drowning in a sea of choices with no shore in sight. Drifting, sinking, silence. 3, 2, rebels without roots. Adolescence against father and mother, tradition, logos. Once upon a time, a rebel was one who rose up against injustice in the name of a higher truth. Today's rebel rises up against truth itself. The modern youth revolt is not a struggle for liberation within an order, but a rebellion against order, against any order, any authority, any inherited wisdom that might guide or constrain. In a fit of adolescent hubris, the youth turn against father and mother, not only their literal parents but all spiritual parents, the ancestors, the traditions, the God of their fathers. Like the prodigal son, they demand their inheritance now, eager to spend it on the pleasures of the far country. Unlike that parable, there is no thought of return, no memory of home. They sever the root and then curse the tree for withering. These are rebels without roots. They define themselves by negation. Whatever came before, they oppose. All that was revered, they profane. In their eyes, every pillar of the past is a prison to be smashed. The law is just an obstacle to freedom. History is a narrative of oppression. Faith is a fairy tale for the naive. They fancy themselves revolutionaries, but having overthrown all reigning truths, they find there is nothing left to crown in their place. So they enthrone chaos itself. It is rebellion for rebellion's sake, a howl against the very notion of structure. This is not the youthful defiance that seeks a new order or a better law. It is a nihilistic defiance that finds glory in the breakdown. Each generation of rebels throws away more of what grounded their forebears, and each finds itself more adrift than the last. In this metaphysical rebellion, even the concept of logos, of a rational divine order to the world, is rejected. Logos means reason, meaning, the word that underlies creation. To the modern rebel, such a notion is intolerable, for it implies a truth higher than the self. They would rather reign in absurdity than serve in truth. Milton's Satan, cast down in Paradise Lost, famously declared, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." So too do these children of disinheritance shout, "Better to rule in the chaos of my own making than submit to a heaven not of my choosing." They unknowingly echo that oldest of rebellions, Lucifer's cry of non serviam, "I will not serve." In casting off the logos, they replay the fall in every heart. But a rebellion that acknowledges no truth can offer no redemption. It destroys but cannot build. When Oedipus killed his father, the act fulfilled a tragic destiny. Yet even Oedipus, blind and broken, sought atonement in the end. When Cain struck down Abel, he at least heard the voice of God pronounce judgment, marking him, sending him wandering with the weight of guilt. Today's rootless rebels seek neither atonement nor even the awareness of guilt. They refuse the burden of conscience. They murder metaphorically the principles and bonds that gave them life, and feel vindicated, not accursed. Yet in truth they carry a mark no less real than Cain's, a spiritual restlessness, a void that drives them ceaselessly from cause to empty cause. They wander east of Eden, away from the presence of any father, convinced that freedom lies in distance rather than closeness. They rebel against father and mother, against the very idea of elders or betters. In the void left by rejecting parental wisdom, they exalt youth itself as the ultimate authority. A tragic irony, as they are lost children, leading lost children. They scorn the lessons of the dead, forgetting that those lessons were paid for in blood and tears. They break the tablets of stone, yet write nothing on their scattered pieces. They tear down monuments and laugh as the rubble skips down the hill. But they do not see that those stones formed the foundations on which they themselves were standing. In their frenzy to defy the past, they have sawed off the branch on which they sat. Now, unrooted, they fall. The rebellion turns inward and feeds on the self. Having rejected the logos without, they find only pathos and chaos within. A rebellion that once targeted external authority now consumes their own hearts, resulting in inner anarchy. Spiritual nihilism sets in. If nothing is true, if no inherited value can be trusted, then what is the point of anything? The slogan on their lips was no gods, no masters. But the echo in their souls is no meaning, no purpose. They have burned the covenant that bound them to their ancestors and to God, and with it they have burned the inheritance, love, purpose, identity, direction. The result is a profound emptiness and anger. They rage at a world that feels false, not realizing it is their own absolutist skepticism that has salted the soil. And yet, even in this darkness, the archetypes persist, haunting them. The figure of the father looms in their psyche, now distorted into an oppressor to be slain. The mother, nature, homeland, origin, becomes something to escape or despoil. The rebel plays out an Oedipal drama on a civilizational scale, striking down the progenitors symbolically and usurping their place, only to find a curse upon the throne. Having denied the logos, the rebel finds he cannot speak a new world into being. His words create only confusion, not creation. In biblical terms, they have traded their birthright for a bowl of ashes. In their rejection of roots, the youth become uprooted themselves. Nietzsche wrote of the death of God and warned of the long night of nihilism that would follow. We are seeing that night now, a cold, starless sky where once there were guiding lights. The younger generation, unmoored, tries to light bonfires of momentary passion to ward off the dark. Protests, manifestos, identity crusades. But each flares up and then dies, leaving only smoke. They do not know how to build the steady hearthfire of a lasting culture because they have spurned the old tinder and flint. A rebellion that began as proud self-assertion ends in lonely self-cannibalization. The snake bites its own tail. The children devour themselves. Listen carefully, and one can hear the ancient warning that has echoed down the ages. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy. We were forewarned of an age when the loss of natural reverence would herald perilous times. Now we live in that fulfillment. In the end, the naive rebel is caught in a paradox. He rebelled to assert his identity, yet by cutting off his roots he has made himself a non-entity, a transient phantom with no past and thus no future. He warred against father and mother, and now wanders an orphan. He denied the logos, and now babbles in tongues he himself cannot decipher. The tragedy is complete, and in the gathering silence after the clamor of revolt, one can almost hear the distant, sorrowful voice of the father still echoing, "Adam, where are you?" But the rebel without roots has no answer, for he no longer knows his own name. 3. The Carnival of Compassion, Weaponized Empathy and Virtue. Porn. Under the bright banners of compassion and empathy, a peculiar carnival now marches through our culture. On its face, it appears a benevolent festival, everyone wearing the colors of kindness, everyone professing concern for the suffering and the marginalized. But step closer, and the scene is grotesque. It is a self-righteous theater, a masquerade where empathy is wielded like a weapon, and virtue is flaunted like gaudy costume jewelry. In this carnival, feeling is lord, and thinking is heretic. Mercy and outrage waltz arm in arm, and the crowd cheers each new display of pious emotion with feverish delight. Welcome to the Carnival of Compassion, a pageant of weaponized empathy and virtue porn, where performing goodness matters more than doing good. Compassion is normally a grace, but in this corrupted spectacle it becomes performance art. We witness the rise of moral exhibitionism, public displays of care and indignation that serve not the victim but the ego of the performer. The term virtue signaling barely captures it. This is virtue as public pornography, stripped of humility and intimacy, designed to arouse admiration from onlookers. Every day brings a new episode, a tearful post that must be shared, an outrage that must be broadcast, a hashtag of solidarity that must trend. The participants derive a thrill from these acts of performative empathy, a hit of moral superiority, a sense of belonging to the good side of a Manichaean drama. Empathy, unmoored from restraint or reason, becomes a high, an intoxicant. And like all intoxications, it demands ever stronger doses, more outrage, more emotional extremes, more victims to display and villains to excoriate. This carnival runs on inversion of values. Emotionalism is exalted as strength, while rational debate is denounced as cold or cruel. To question the crying mob is to reveal oneself a heartless monster. So the crowd polices itself with zeal. Any whisper of dissent is drowned by shouts of "Have you no compassion?" Reason is put in the stocks and pelted with tomatoes. Meanwhile, empathy unrestrained becomes tyrannical. What began as sensitivity to suffering mutates into hypersensitivity that demands censorship of anything that might cause offense or discomfort. They claim to champion the vulnerable, yet in their crusade to shield feelings at all costs, they treat people as brittle children. No tough truths, no honest disagreements can be allowed. The Carnival of Compassion must be an unbroken parade of uplifting narratives and righteous crusades, unsullied by complexity. Observe the grim spectacles that play out in this moral carnival, and public shamings as entertainment. Digital crowds gather to cancel and condemn, transforming social media into a pillory. Old mistakes or unorthodox opinions are dug up and paraded as trophies of outrage. Under the banner of empathy for some victim, a virtual mob gleefully destroys a real person's livelihood or reputation. They call it justice. In truth, it is vengeance as virtue, cruelty draped in the language of care. Outrage contests. Compassion becomes competitive. Who can express the most extreme outrage at the latest issue? Who can weep the loudest for the latest tragedy? In this grotesque pageant, sincerity is suspect. Only extravagant displays count. If your heart is breaking, you must prove it by joining the chorus of indignation. Woe to the one who withholds public tears. They will be accused of indifference. And virtue merchandising, empathy is commercialized and politicized. Companies and influencers don the mantle of virtuous causes to boost their brand, selling righteousness like a product. Charity campaigns become PR stunts, apologies are scripted and choreographed. It's all a show, compassion cosplay. The substance of virtue is less important than the aesthetics of virtue. Selective mercy, selective rage. In the carnival of compassion, empathy is fickle and factional. The crowd only extends empathy to those it has anointed as victims du jour. Others are demonized without mercy. One group's pain is amplified with solemn fervor, while another group's pain is dismissed or even mocked. This weaponized empathy thus divides and deceives. It has no universal heart, only tribal sentiment. At the core of this phenomenon is a tragic confusion. Feeling is mistaken for morality. The carnival teaches that to be good, one must feel strongly and display those feelings conspicuously. As a result, moral principles rooted in reason, the logos, are supplanted by a fluctuating emotional consensus. Right and wrong are determined not by any enduring standard, but by the collective mood of the moment. If the crowd weeps, then we must all weep. If the crowd rages, we must all rage. This is a perilous compass for society. Empathy without logos can be manipulated. It can justify witch hunts and lynchings as easily as it can inspire charity. History shows how mobs feeling righteous can commit great atrocities. Yet in our time, we enshrine the mob's feelings as sacred. We have made an idol of empathy, and like all false gods, it demands sacrifice. Indeed, the social body is stiffening and dying under this unchecked emotionalism. By replacing logos with pathos as the guiding light, we have lost the balance that keeps a culture healthy. As Chesterton observed long ago, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity is often untruthful. So it is now, compassion, cut off from truth and humility, has gone mad. We see mercy wielded without justice, forgiveness demanded without repentance, empathy lavished without discernment. His mercy would mean mere anarchy, Chesterton wrote of such a one, and our society too now tilts toward anarchy of the emotions, a chaos where feelings override facts and everyone must tiptoe around the loudest sob or shriek. In this chaos, genuine virtue withers. True compassion, quiet, patient, selfless, cannot survive in the blaring carnival. It is drowned out by the noise. True justice, measured, principled, blind to status, cannot function when popularity and emotion rule the courts of public opinion. We have, in effect, deified empathy and demonized reason, and the result is a kind of collective hysteria touted as moral progress. It is reminiscent of a society under the spell of a Dionysian frenzy, where ecstatic emotion sweeps away inhibitions and balance. But when the frenzy ends, one finds only wreckage. Reputations unjustly ruined, dialogues permanently poisoned, a populace exhausted and mistrustful. The empathy that was meant to heal ends up tearing wounds open, again and again, for the spectacle of it. And how does this carnival end? Perhaps it ends when the performers collapse from exhaustion, when outrage fatigue sets in, when the audience becomes jaded by the constant emotional grandstanding. Or it ends when reality, cold, hard truth, intrudes like the rising sun at dawn, revealing that the costumes and masks were not real virtue at all. At some point, the logos, the truth we tried to banish, returns to judge the frenzy. Already there are murmurs at the edges of the tent, whispers that this public virtue is inauthentic, that this constant indignation is unsustainable. The deepest irony is that a society cannot survive on empathy alone. Feelings cannot build bridges or cure diseases or impart wisdom. Eventually, the real work of civilization must be done by sober minds and steady hands, after the carnival has moved on. As the prophetic critique gives way finally to poetic vision, picture the carnival grounds at midnight, strewn with confetti and ashes, the laughter faded, the bright posters peeling. A few lonely figures remain, mascara of feigned compassion running down their cheeks like black tears. The air is heavy and still, emotions spent, purpose gone. The emptiness that empathy cannot fill settles in. Silence. In that silence, perhaps a new clarity can be found. The heart, quiet now, might remember what it has forgotten, that compassion is strongest when yoked with truth, that love must align with logos, or it becomes lunacy. The carnival is over, the gaudy lights dim, and in the dawn's gray light, the society that indulged in this orgy of feeling must reckon with the hangover of unreason. The naive rebels wanted a world run by pure compassion. They have learned painfully that compassion without wisdom cannot sustain or save. In the end, the naive rebel comes full circle. From permission without purpose, to rebellion without roots, to compassion without compass. Each stage has been a story of something good corrupted when cut loose from its source. Liberty without truth led to chaos. Rebellion without justice led to nihilism. Empathy without logos led to madness. The chapter began in structured prophecy and ends in fragmented poetry, mirroring the disintegrating structures we have surveyed. What emerges from these ruins? Perhaps a humble realization. To heal the spiritual and ideological corruption of the youth and of the age, the scattered pieces must be reassembled. Freedom married again to purpose, rebellion tempered by reverence, compassion guided by truth. Otherwise, the carnival of the naive rebel becomes the funeral procession of a culture that died of its own corrupted virtues. Rituals of the death drive. Training the body for sacrifice. From gym selfie to battlefield selfie. Modern culture's obsession with sculpting and displaying the body has taken on an almost ritualistic character. In gleaming gyms lined with mirrors, young men and women perform repetitive rites of iron and sweat, recording themselves in countless selfies. Social media rewards this exhibitionism, making it a very short step from watching yourself in the mirror doing those reps to inviting all your Instagram friends to watch. The fitness world is structurally narcissistic, driven by a spirit of self-absorption that encourages constant self-admiration. This ritual outwardly appears to celebrate strength and health, but at a deeper level it resembles a training for self-sacrifice. The individual's inner life, their soul and sense of higher purpose, is gradually being killed off in service of an image. Under the guise of fitness and empowerment, the body is being honed not for genuine service or creativity, but for spectacle. Influencers contort themselves for the perfect shot, and digital exhibitionism becomes an end in itself. Scholars note that digital exhibitionism online erodes the line between authentic self and performed self, fostering a feedback loop with voyeurism. In effect, the person becomes an object, a sacrifice on the altar of the gaze. Nowhere is this more stark than on platforms like OnlyFans, a site one critic calls a virtual meat market, where men pay women to degrade themselves, providing subscribers with nothing more than a hollow sense of connection. Here the body is literally commodified and offered up for spectators. The purported empowerment masks what is essentially a ritual of self-exploitation, a willing offering of one's intimacy and dignity for the transient reward of clicks, cash, and false validation. As Georges Bataille observed, sacrifice is nothing other than the production of sacred things, and in this context the sacred produced is a twisted parody of intimacy and fame. The individual's life force is expended, sacrificed, to feed an endless cycle of content that ultimately signifies nothing. Even the aesthetic of militarism bleeds into this narcissistic cult of the body. The line between gym selfie and battlefield selfie has blurred. Camo-clad young soldiers now pose in war zones the same way a fitness model might pose in a locker room. In a time when fighters carry smartphones, war itself becomes just another backdrop for self-branding. A striking example is the phenomenon of jihadi propaganda embracing bodybuilding culture. Islam Yakin, an Egyptian youth who once avidly pursued a chiseled physique, would post proud gym videos saying every guy dreams of having a six-pack, and have people check him out. Not long after, he appeared in an ISIS video doing a workout, dedicated to the Mujahideen in Syria, wielding his honed body now as a tool of holy war. In this perverse journey, the gym selfie transformed into a battlefield selfie. The ritual of displaying bodily power slid seamlessly from the realm of vanity into the realm of violence. He is not alone. Soldiers across conflict snap photos before battle, weapon in hand and muscles on display, collapsing the distinction between training for combat and training for Instagram. A Reuters photo series captured Libyan army fighters taking a smiling selfie before entering the area of clashes, literal meters from lethal danger. The pose is the same as in peacetime gym mirrors. Look at me. But now the stakes are life and death. What drives this convergence of narcissistic exhibition and self-annihilation? On the surface, the young bodybuilder and the armed militant seem worlds apart, yet both are entranced by a deathward pull masked as mastery. In striving to become an icon of fitness or of war, they offer themselves to something larger, to meaninglessness itself. The gym addict punishes his body daily, risking injury or worse, chasing an ever-elusive ideal. Indeed, the toll is real. Excessive steroid use and extreme diets have led to a spate of young bodybuilders dying from heart failure, sacrifices to the ideal of the perfect body. The militant, for his part, offers his life to an abstract cause, often in performative acts of martyrdom or ultraviolence. Both are captured by what Freud called the death drive, a compulsion beyond reason that pushes individuals to repeat harmful patterns and ultimately to destroy the self. The body is trained to destroy itself, if not immediately in battle, then slowly through spiritual starvation and commodification. As one cultural critic wryly noted, look at me is not a masculine move, nor a feminine one, nor a humane one. It is the cry of a self being drained of true life and hollowed into an idol. In this ritual of the death drive, flesh is idolized and then offered up. The final sacrifice may take many forms: a burnt-out soul behind a beautiful Instagram feed, a body broken by overwork and drugs, or a life thrown away in a blaze of glory on some distant battlefield livestream. All share a grim logic: the worship of the self ends in the wasting of the self. Streaming the snuff, voyeurism, terror, and the new sacrament of viewing. While countless youths make sacrifices of themselves in pursuit of an empty ideal, an even larger congregation gathers to watch these sacrifices. In a dark mirror of religious communion, society has developed a sacrament of viewing, an insatiable appetite for consuming images of violence, terror, and degradation. We now stream the snuff. In private, glowing screens serve as altars where the faithful voyeurs partake in their daily sacrificial fare, endless videos of cruelty, shock, and titillation. It is a ritual of the modern age that rivals the blood-soaked arenas of antiquity. St. Augustine, over 15 centuries ago, told the story of his friend Alypius, who was addicted to watching gladiatorial games. Alypius thought himself morally above it, until one day he could not resist peeking. At that moment he opened his eyes and was stricken with a deeper wound in the soul than the man got in the body. He drank deep of the savagery, and found that the lust of watching death had become a parasitic disease upon his spirit. What was true in the Roman Colosseum is just as true in the age of YouTube and TikTok. We believe ourselves mere spectators, but the images of blood and lust carve wounds in our souls. Today it is extraordinarily and terrifyingly easy to peer into the most violent corners of the world from the safety of one's home. With a few clicks, anyone can witness gruesome cruelty. The widely viewed ISIS beheadings are an infamous example, as are live-streamed mass shootings that play out in real time on social media. We scroll past videos of real murders, suicides, torture, war footage, extreme pornography, revenge porn, humiliation, even the filmed final moments of victims of terror, often algorithmically served up without us even seeking them. Like the crowds in the Colosseum, we have become consumers of violence. The blood may not splatter us physically, but it stains the psyche. The ritual is perversely sacramental. We consume suffering as a form of entertainment or morbid fascination, much as communicants consume the body and blood. But unlike true sacraments which aim to impart grace or meaning, this new sacrament offers no nourishment. It is the anti-communion of a nihilistic culture. Consuming images of death and debauchery only deepens our spiritual starvation. Each horrific video is like another gulp of salt water to a thirsty soul, enticing, yet ultimately leaving one more parched and doubting. The psychological and spiritual cost of this voyeurism is profound. We, the spectators, become complicit in the acts we observe, even if only as silent accomplices. Ask how we, as observers, are complicit in the violence we consume. as well as how we suffer its destructive consequences on our voyeuristic gazes, one theologian urges. Every view, every click, is a minor act of endorsement, a nod that this is acceptable fodder for our attention. In these rituals of viewing, meaning is not created but hollowed out. The more we delegate our sense of reality to these extreme images, the more doubt whispers, is anything real or worthy? Over time, a spiritual void yawns open. Young people who grow up on a diet of violent video clips and hardcore pornography find it harder to derive joy from normal life, or empathy for real suffering. The spectacle replaces reality. The whispering doubt arises that only the extreme is authentic, and everything else is boring or fake. Hannah Arendt warned that totalitarianism flourishes when people lose the distinction between truth and spectacle, when the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, the standards of thought, no longer exist. In the algorithmic echo chambers of TikTok and the dark forums of the internet, that blurring is well underway. The viewer of endless cruelty comes to live in a liminal state, numb, cynical, craving ever stronger stimuli to feel anything at all. Meanwhile, the culture at large celebrates this voyeuristic frenzy under the euphemism of staying informed or entertainment. Violence as entertainment is not new. Ancient Rome made sport of slaughter. But today's digital Colosseum is boundless and private. There is no emperor's decree forcing us to watch. We choose it, and even fetishize it. The term snuff film once described illicit recordings of actual murders meant to gratify twisted viewers. Now our mainstream platforms host 1,000 mini snuffs, live suicides on Instagram, fatal TikTok challenges, dashcam footage of brutal accidents, Warzone live feeds. In 2021, a TikTok blackout challenge, which dared kids to choke themselves unconscious, went viral and led to the deaths of multiple children who attempted it. Millions of strangers morbidly followed the story, turning grief into trending content. Likewise, when ISIS terrorists staged beheadings or when a white supremacist massacred people while live streaming, these videos circulated widely, shared in private messages, dissected on forums, generating millions of views. The act of watching becomes a ritual of its own, a secret communion in darkness, wherein the viewer's soul is gradually desensitized and hollowed. Susan Sontag once noted that looking at others' pain can either incite conscience or deaden it. Today, it too often deadens. The more we watch, the more our sense of reality disintegrates. We come to inhabit a spectral world, glutted on images of death yet somehow hungry for meaning. A legion of Alypius-like voyeurs, wounded in spirit and debilitated by the addiction. And still, we continue to watch. Why? There is a dark thrill in voyeurism, a perverse sacrificial offering from the viewer's side as well. We sacrifice a part of our innocence, our empathy, each time we indulge. It is as if the death drive that pushes some to perform violence ropes in the passive masses to participate by viewing. The act of watching itself becomes as violent as the game, Augustine suggested, for the gaze enables and furthers the spectacle. In our era, the gaze of millions is what these spectacle killers crave. The live mass murderer, the torture streamer, even the revenge porn uploader. They count on our eyes. By giving them attention, we complete the ritual circle, performer and audience united in an unholy sacrament of destruction. This is the new liturgy of nihilism, to sit in the pew of one's own room, bathed in the flicker of atrocities on a screen, and let one's humanity quietly drain away. We think we are just entertaining ourselves, but in truth we are participants in a spiritual sacrifice, offering up our compassion, our peace of mind, and our capacity for goodness to the insatiable idol of spectacle. Communion of code, memes, forums, and the liturgy of violence. If the spectacle of violence is the new sacrament, then internet forums and meme cultures are its new churches, complete with their own liturgies and scriptures. In shadowed corners of the digital world, an ironic communion is taking place. Young people gather not in physical spaces but in image boards, subreddit threads, private discords, modern catacombs of code, where they share in rituals of extremist ideology thinly veiled as humor. Here, irony becomes incantation. Memes, those playful, absurd images and slogans, turn into creeds. What starts as satire can curdle into dogma, as repeated joking references to violence or hate gradually lose their irony and solidify into true belief. It often begins innocently enough. A teenager stumbles onto an edgy meme page, laughing at the outrageous for the lulz content. Inside these communities, a distinctive language and rhythm is established, an in-group liturgy of catchphrases, symbols, and inside jokes. Participating means repeating the lines, sharing the memes, performing the irreverence. Humorous, bizarre, or bewildering, internet memes form a fast-moving language that often divides insiders from outsiders. This initiation through shared code binds the community. But not all communities are benign. Many use this coded language to spread hateful or extremist ideology under the guise of humor. In these digital cloisters, memes are deployed to promote extremist narratives under the guise of pop cultural aesthetics, humor, and irony, thus lowering the barrier for participation. The irony is the spoonful of sugar that makes the poison go down. A racist or nihilistic idea, wrapped in a SpongeBob or Pepe the Frog meme, doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like a game, a joke. So newcomers indulge, repeat the meme, share it, laugh. But over time, prolonged exposure in this closed liturgy breeds a slow conversion. The absurd starts to become normalized. The hateful punchline becomes a familiar chorus. As researchers found, prolonged exposure in these meme communities makes young participants more tolerant of radical and extreme ideologies, including racism, misogyny, and bigotry. In essence, they are unwittingly chanting along to a massive desensitization. What was ironic one day becomes sincere belief the next, and the distance between posting a joke about violence and committing violence grows dangerously thin. The internet forums where these memes circulate often explicitly frame their activities in ritualistic and religious terms, half joking, half serious. On notorious Chan boards, like 4chan, 8chan, users who commit acts of violence are literally canonized in meme form. After the Christchurch massacre in 2019, the perpetrator Brenton Tarrant was lauded as a saint on these boards, and those who imitated him were praised as his disciples. This is not metaphor. These are the exact terms used. In dark humor, an entire cult of martyrdom has formed, where each new mass shooter is eagerly discussed as if he were achieving high status in a video game or ascending to sainthood. One report documented how users on such forums gamified their hate, issuing achievements like Krusty Kebab, burn down a mosque or gender equality, kill a Jewess to encourage ever more extreme acts. What is this, if not a liturgy of violence? The forum itself provides the hymns, memes, the scripture manifestos full of in-jokes, and even the call and response. One user posts a provocative "It's time for violent revolution, just kidding, unless?" and dozens reply with approving meme reactions or further escalation. The community thus reinforces itself, sacralizing violence in a cloak of pseudo-irony. They perform a collective ritual of winking hatred, where each amen is an upvote on a post celebrating brutality. Coded language in these spaces also serves as a form of initiation. To even understand the memes, one must learn the references, the dog whistles, the historical memes of past saints and events. It's a bit like learning Latin to participate in an old church service. Once fluent in the argot, members feel inside the circle, privy to secret knowledge. This engenders a false sense of camaraderie and purpose. A young man alienated in the real world might feel suddenly at home among others who speak his language of ironic nihilism and rage. Yet this very virtuality gives a false sense of distance. Because it's all just online, participants often convince themselves and outsiders that it's not serious. This is the great delusion of the digital death cult, that one can revel in hate and death as roleplay and remain untouched. After all, typing a slur or sharing a meme doesn't spill any blood, right? The screen seems to insulate from consequences. But this ritual deferral of action, this idea that we are only joking, we are only hypothetically sacrificing, not really doing it, is extremely perilous. It ritually defers the confrontation with evil, allowing it to fester. The distance can collapse in an instant, and has done so, tragically, many times. The joking stops abruptly when the latest initiate decides to prove his devotion in the real world with gunfire or homemade bombs. Then the forum church may feign shock, or more often celebrates, turning the act into yet another meme. In these moments, the evil that was incubating behind layers of code erupts at our doorstep, undeniable. Illustration: an artist's depiction of a child being offered to the idol Moloch. In modern metaphor, Moloch represents any insatiable force, war, technology, ideology, that demands the sacrifice of youth and innocence. Increasingly, it feels like all these strands, the narcissistic self-sacrifice of the body, the voyeuristic consumption of suffering, and the extremist meme cults, are intertwining into one gigantic death ritual that our whole society is enacting. The ancients spoke of Moloch, the bull-headed god that families sacrificed their children to, burning them alive in hopes of favor. Today we have no statues of bronze, but we do sacrifice our children, both literally in youth sent to wars with hollow causes or kids lost to suicidal internet challenges, and spiritually in generations fed on despair, cynicism, and vice. The modern Moloch is faceless and pervasive, part economic system, part digital network, part ideological vortex. It whispers that nothing is sacred, nothing is true, except the spectacle of destruction. And to this cruel idol, we offer up our vitality, our virtue, our hope. We train our bodies to be beautiful and strong, only to feed them to the flames of social approval or combat. We train our eyes on every horror, drinking in the suffering of others until we feel nothing. We train our minds on toxic ironies until we cannot recognize truth or goodness, even if it stands before us weeping. In this chapter's journey from gym selfies to war selfies, from voyeuristic sacraments to meme communions, the tone has darkened from analysis to prophecy, because the path we are on is unmistakably apocalyptic. We are approaching a spiritual tipping point. If these rituals of the death drive continue unabated, we may awake to a world where actual apocalypse is not just a metaphor. A society that glorifies self-obsession and nihilism cannot sustain itself, it will implode or explode. In the prophetic imagination, one can already see the ominous signs. A pale rider galloping across our feeds, named Death, a crimson haze of war and hatred rising like a storm. In the streets and in the hearts of the young, a battle between Eros life and Thanatos death is underway. Will we continue to intone the liturgy of violence until it summons real bloodshed in every neighborhood? Or can we break the spell and seek renewal? At the end of this chapter, the vision is deliberately dire, for one must see the darkness clearly to overcome it. Yet within the darkness, the very act of naming these rituals is a first exorcism. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, says the biblical word. Even as we describe this cultural descent, the body offered on the altar of vanity, the soul lost in the voyeur's abyss, the mind ensnared in coded hate, we do so to affirm that it need not be this way. For now, however, the trend is heading into night. In this gathering gloom, one hopes for a dawn, but it will require a spiritual revolt, a rejection of the false idols, and a reclaiming of authentic meaning. Otherwise, the youth of today risk becoming, en masse, a generation of sacrificial lambs led to slaughter. With society at large both high priest and congregation of the slaughterhouse, the spectacle will reach its gruesome climax, and there will be no one left untouched by the blood. Let us heed this warning while we can still turn away from the abyss. The hour grows late, and the ritual bonfires of the death drive are burning ever higher, threatening to consume all that is human in their ravenous flames. In the next chapter, we will seek possible paths of resistance and redemption. But for now we sit with the full weight of this vision, a culture entranced by death, in love with its own demise, performing elaborate dances on the edge of the abyss. It is a dance macabre on a global scale. And unless the music stops, we may all soon find ourselves participants in a final unwelcome spectacle, one that no one can turn off, and from which there can be no voyeuristic distance. The time to break the spell is now, before the ritual claims any more of our youth and our humanity. Let this dark vision be a catalyst for awakening, rather than a prophecy fulfilled. The choice, collectively, is still ours to make. Chapter 5, Reclaiming, Meaning, the theology of the body revisited, integrating Eros and Logos after the fall. Michelangelo's famous depiction of the creation of Adam portrays the human body receiving the divine spark of life. In our fallen world, Eros, the deep yearning for love and union, often becomes either an idol of self-gratification or an enemy to be feared. Yet originally Eros was meant to serve Logos, leading us toward truth. As St. John Paul II observed, Eros implies the upward impulse of the human heart toward what is true, good, and beautiful. Rightly ordered, our passionate love points beyond itself, towards the transcendent source of love. Eros, aligned with Logos, becomes a force that weds love with truth, desire with divine meaning, rather than a blind impulse dragging us into darkness. Theology of the Body offers a healing integration of these realities. During a series of 129 addresses, John Paul II reinterpreted human sexuality and the dignity of the body in light of divine truth. Far from prudish repression or libertine indulgence, he proposed that the body is neither a false god nor a prison of the soul, but a vessel for sacred encounter. The human body, male and female, has a language designed by the Creator. It alone is capable of making visible the invisible, the spiritual and divine. In marital love, our bodies speak a truth inscribed by God, becoming a living sign of the gift of self. Even in celibacy, the body witnesses to a devotion beyond the flesh. In every state, the Christian vision insists that our flesh is made for communion, imbued with a purpose and dignity that reflect our Creator's image. This stands in stark contrast to the disembodied and commodified sexuality so prevalent in modern culture. On one hand, a neo-Puritan distrust treats the body as a corrupting enemy. On the other, a secular hedonism worships the body as an idol for pleasure. Both extremes sever eros from logos. Pope Benedict XVI warned that today's ostensible exaltation of the body is deeply deceptive. Eros cut off from truth easily degrades into lust and exploitation. Eros, reduced to pure sex, has become a commodity, a mere thing to be bought and sold, or rather man himself becomes a commodity, he observed. This is hardly man's great yes to the body. When desire is divorced from truth, the person is objectified, the body is used and discarded, leading not to fulfillment but to emptiness. In reaction, some have rejected eros entirely as suspect, but that too is a tragedy, a hatred of bodiliness that denies the goodness of God's creation. Authentic Christianity charts a third way. It acknowledges how the fall wounded our sexuality with shame and concupiscence, yet it proclaims the redemption of eros through grace. In Christ, body and spirit are reunited in harmony. Christian faith, Benedict notes, has always considered man a unity in duality, a reality in which spirit and matter compenetrate. True, eros tends to rise in ecstasy towards the divine. Yet for this very reason it calls for a path of ascent, renunciation, purification, and healing. In other words, eros finds its true grandeur when disciplined by love of the good and the true. Revisiting the theology of the body illuminates how love aligned with truth heals the split in the modern soul. Our bodies are not meaningless slabs of matter or playthings for pleasure, they are sanctuaries of personhood and potential temples of the Holy Spirit. The incarnation itself, God entering our world as a man of flesh and blood, forever sanctified human embodiment. Therefore, we can neither despise the body nor deify it. We are called instead to honor the body as a sacred gift, integrating our sexuality with our full humanity. In practical terms, this means seeing one's own and others' bodies as sacraments of presence, channels through which love and logos can be expressed. It means rejecting the culture's lies that reduce persons to pixels or pleasure units, and instead reclaiming a view of sexuality as an insight into the very nature of God Himself, God who is love. Eros, when reordered towards its divine purpose, becomes not a force of corruption but of creative communion. It draws us out of the lonely silos of nihilism into relationship, ultimately into relationship with truth himself. In this reintegration of eros and logos, the youth of today can rediscover that their longing has a destination. Our desires, cleansed and guided by truth, lead us up from the wreckage of misuse toward the light of meaning. The body, once again, becomes a pilgrim of the eternal, capable of revealing and encountering the divine in the here and now. Pedagogy of reality, teaching, metaphysics in a pixelated age. We live in a time when reality itself often feels pixelated. Surrounded by digital images, rapid-fire updates, and virtual simulations, young people can become strangers to the real. The modern educational system, too, has largely abandoned the grand quest for truth with a capital T in favor of utilitarian and technical knowledge. The result is a widening metaphysical void. Many youth, having never been invited to ponder first principles or ultimate ends, drift in a sea of relativism and confusion. They are bombarded with information yet hungry for wisdom, no longer knowing what is true amid a chaos of competing screens and slogans. Reclaiming meaning in such an age requires a radical return to reality, a renewed pedagogy of the real that reintroduces metaphysics, wonder, and classical reasoning as the foundation of education. For inspiration, we can look to the ancients and the great tradition of liberal learning. Plato compared ordinary human ignorance to prisoners chained in a cave, mistaking shadows on a wall for the real objects behind them. The role of education, in his view, was not to comfort us with pleasant illusions, but to liberate us into truth, to turn our souls toward the light. Education isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul, Socrates says. Education takes for granted that sight is there but isn't turned the right way. It tries to redirect it appropriately. Teaching is thus a work of reorientation, a guided pilgrimage from appearance to reality. Likewise, Aristotle began his metaphysics with the simple observation that all men by nature desire to know. There is a built-in longing in us to grasp what is real and true. The task of a true teacher is to nourish that longing, to kindle the spark of wonder into a flame of knowledge. The classical educators did not shy away from big questions of being, purpose, and the good. Instead, those questions were the very core of education. Early Christian thinkers carried this torch forward. St. Augustine, for example, realized that every restless heart ultimately thirsts for God as its truth, and St. Thomas Aquinas harmonized faith with reason, showing that reality from the tiniest creature up to the angels is an ordered participation in being itself in God. Such models insist that education is not just about skills for making a living, but wisdom for living well. Today, by contrast, much of education has become spiritually antiseptic, focused on test scores and marketable skills, while ignoring the formation of the soul. We produce students adept at navigating virtual platforms or manipulating data, but ill-equipped to discern truth from lies or meaning from nihilism. As C.S. Lewis warned in The Abolition of Man, we are at risk of creating men without chests, people with developed intellects but atrophied hearts and imaginations. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. Lewis's critique pinpoints the failure to cultivate conscience and character alongside cognition. If students are not taught to love what is true and good, no amount of technical knowledge will prevent moral bankruptcy. A pedagogy of reality must therefore engage the whole person. It must form the moral imagination through story, art, and example, not in order to indoctrinate, but to awaken the capacity to recognize goodness and beauty. It must train the intellect in logic and metaphysics, so that the student can pierce through sophistries and see things as they are. And it must inculcate humility and awe, for the truth of being is vast and wondrous, inviting lifelong reverence. Such an education faces stiff headwinds in the pixelated environment our youth inhabit. Digital distraction is one of the great obstacles to depth of thought. The onslaught of notifications, messages, and media fragments the attention span. A recent international survey found that about 65% of students reported being regularly distracted in class by their digital devices. American teens receive a median of 273 smartphone notifications per day, with a large portion arriving during school hours. Little wonder that sustained contemplation or immersion in a single train of thought has become harder to achieve. When every free moment is filled with the buzz of a phone, the dissolution of contemplation is nearly complete. Silence and stillness, where metaphysical insight might dawn, are crowded out by constant stimuli. Reclaiming a pedagogy of reality will therefore require intentional countermeasures to the digital frenzy. Educators and mentors can help by carving out tech-free sanctuaries of time and space, classrooms or programs that prioritize face-to-face dialogue, reading of physical books, contact with nature, and moments of quiet reflection. Studies have already correlated heavy in-class device use with lower academic performance and understanding, underscoring that the mind needs focus to grasp truth. Some schools now implement digital Sabbaths or limit laptops in certain lessons to refocus attention on the teacher and the subject at hand. These practical steps, though small, contribute to rerouting learning in the present reality of things, rather than the flicker of endless virtual feeds. Ultimately, teaching metaphysics in a pixelated age is about rekindling wonder in the face of reality. It is saying to the next generation, there is a truth, there is a world outside your head and your apps, and it is intelligible and meaningful. The role of the teacher and indeed any leader of youth becomes in a sense prophetic, to cut through the fog of noise and point to the sky of transcendentals beyond, to whisper to the prisoner of the modern cave that the sun still shines. This can happen in a literature class that grapples with the eternal human questions, or a science class that doesn't shy from the philosophical amazement at the order of nature, or a mentorship discussion about why human life matters. We must reteach the young how to ask why. Again, not just how do I do this, but for what ultimate purpose? And what is it all for? By restoring classical reasoning and contemplative wonder to education, we help the youth rebuild an inner framework that connects knowledge to being. In that framework, facts find context, and values find foundation. The next generation, instead of floating in a relativistic void or getting lost in virtual reality, can become rooted in what is real, the enduring structures of truth, goodness, and beauty that underlie our existence. This pedagogical renewal forms not only sharper minds, but whole persons, young men and women equipped with both discernment and devotion, capable of resisting the seductive nihilisms of our age because they have come to know and love reality in its fullness. The feast of life, communities that celebrate being over, nothingness. If the malady of our times is a collapse of meaning and a slide into nihilism, then the antidote must be more than individual insight. It must also be communal renewal. Human beings are inherently social. We discover our fullest meaning not in isolation but in fellowship, in shared life. Yet today's youth often find themselves alienated, each locked in their own bubble of social media feeds, or adrift in fragmented communities, with no common vision of the good. The cultural ethos of nothing really matters breeds loneliness and despair. Pope Benedict XVI noted that expressions of contemporary nihilism have crept in even unconsciously, infecting a great many young people in Vatican.va with a sense of emptiness. Against this bleak backdrop, we urgently need communities that celebrate being over nothingness, communities that come together in truth, goodness, and beauty to affirm that life is meaningful and worth rejoicing in. In such gathered circles of hope, true joy can mount a sacred defiance against the cult of nothing. At the heart of this renewal is a recovery of the Christian sacramental worldview. Christianity has always been a faith of both word and table, of proclamation and feast. It's no coincidence that Jesus left his followers not a mere philosophy, but a communal meal, the Eucharist, which literally means thanksgiving. In the Eucharistic liturgy, the Mass, believers assemble to encounter the real presence of Christ under the humble forms of bread and wine. This is the ultimate feast of life, a celebration in which earthly nourishment becomes a conduit of heavenly grace. Benedict XVI beautifully described how Jesus at the Last Supper bestows on us the feast of life, the liturgy of his death and resurrection as an ongoing banquet of hope. The Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci, 1490s. The quintessential image of a community gathered in sacred meal, a symbol of divine presence in shared life. In partaking of the Eucharist, the community enacts a reality utterly opposed to nihilism. It proclaims that being is good, that creation is charged with God's presence, and that our ultimate destiny is an eternal banquet in the kingdom of God. Every Sunday, indeed, every Mass, is meant to be a mini rebellion against meaninglessness, a coming together to taste and see that the Lord is good, and that life has an author and a purpose. Surrounding the Eucharist are other communal rituals, singing together, exchanging the sign of peace, confessing a common creed, serving one another, all of which reinforce the bonds of shared meaning. In this sacramental vision, the community itself becomes a sign, an embodied witness that we are not alone and our lives are not arbitrary. As the early Christians described it, we become one body in Christ, each member valued and responsible for the others. Here, truth is not just an abstract concept, but is lived in love. Goodness is practiced in works of mercy. Beauty is celebrated in art and song. A healthy community will feast not only on sacred bread and wine, but on everything that is life-giving. Shared meals around a family table, communal celebrations of holidays and rites of passage, appreciation of nature and art, acts of collective service to those in need. All these are forms of festivity that anchor us in being and stave off the abyss of nothingness. Such embodied, celebratory communities have the power to defeat nihilism in a way arguments alone cannot. Where nihilism says nothing matters, a joyous community demonstrates meaning by the very act of coming together in love. Consider the simple joy of a group of friends holding a weekly dinner, or a neighborhood gathering for a festival. These are not trivial routines, they are quiet revolutions against the loneliness and cynicism of our age. They assert that being is better than non-being, that there is value in our existence that merits celebration. True joy in this sense is an act of defiance. Joy is an act of defiance, one novelist wrote. With joy we win, even if we lose. To have lived well is a victory all its own. While the nihilist, seeing no intrinsic meaning, might scoff at celebrations as delusions, the community of hope replies that joy creates meaning by affirming the goodness that is there, however obscured. This does not imply a naive denial of suffering. Rather, it is a sacred defiance, a choice to affirm value in spite of suffering. We see this sacred defiance in martyrs singing hymns in their chains, or persecuted people lighting Advent candles in a secret basement, or youth groups volunteering amidst blighted city streets. Every time individuals gather with love and purpose, to pray, to work for justice, to create art, or simply to encourage one another, they push back the choking weeds of nihilism and clear space for hope to take root. They become what Václav Havel called the power of the powerless, living in truth and thus slowly transforming a culture from within. The feast of life is both a present reality and a future promise. Here and now, it takes the form of communities of light in the twilight of a secular age, families, churches, friendships, and movements that choose being over nothingness in their habits and values. Ultimately, it points toward the great fulfillment that Christianity envisions, the wedding feast of the Lamb, an eternal communion of God and redeemed creation. Toward that end, those who hope bear an invincible hope, like a lamp shining through the night. They keep the oil of faith and love ready, anticipating the moment when the bridegroom arrives and all hunger is satisfied in an everlasting celebration of life. In the words of Benedict XVI, believers bear within them invincible hope, like a lamp to light them on their way through the night beyond death to arrive at the great feast of life, Vatican.va. This hope is the final answer to nihilism, where nihilism ends in nothing. Hope ends in a feast. As we conclude this journey, this critique of spiritual corruption and nihilism, we do so on a note of resolution and challenge. The ruins of meaning that surround us need not be our tomb, they can become the foundation stones for rebuilding. Rebuilding will require courage, yes, and perseverance. It will demand a refusal to capitulate to cynicism, a refusal to say all is lost. Instead, it asks us to respond with sacred defiance and hope, to affirm meaning precisely where it was denied. Reclaiming meaning starts in the individual soul reorienting to truth, grows in the renewal of education and imagination, and blossoms in communities that live out joy and love. Each of us can take part in this renewal. We can honor our bodies and relationships as holy gifts, rather than treating them as tools or toys. We can seek reality in a world of artifice, studying, questioning, contemplating, and refusing to be satisfied with easy lies. We can foster or join communities that celebrate life and guard the flame of hope. In doing so, we become, like the wise maidens of the gospel, bearers of light in a darkening world. We become co-creators of a culture that says yes to life over death, meaning over absurdity, being over nothingness. The youth of today, and all of us, stand before a choice. We can either resign ourselves to the hollowness and fragmentation that have been handed down, or we can rebel for the good. A rebellion that is paradoxically gentle and grounded. It is the rebellion of planting gardens in wastelands, of building fellowship where trust has eroded, of telling the truth in an age of lies, of worshiping God in an age that has forgotten Him. This is not an escapist fantasy, but what one might call a sacred realism, facing the darkness without succumbing to it, because we hold to a greater light. Let us choose that sacred realism. Let us, with God's grace, reclaim meaning from the meaninglessness. In the echo of divine creation, let fiat lux, let there be light, be our cry as well. And as that light spreads from heart to heart, home to home, classroom to classroom, altar to altar, we will find ourselves participants in the feast of life that has no end. In hope and in truth, we raise our cups to this feast, and step forward, not with despair, but with defiant joy. The night is not endless, dawn will come. Our task now is simply to keep the flame alive and the table set, inviting all who hunger for meaning to come and eat. In that faithful celebration, nihilism meets its defeat, and the long winter gives way to spring. From abyss to ascent. Choosing blessing over curse. We stand at the brink of a genuine spiritual crisis. The descent of modern youth culture into meaninglessness is real. A generation flirting with nihilism, performing rituals of death and self-erasure as if to fill a void that nothing material can satisfy. We have witnessed young souls numbed by the collapse of truth and the loss of self, drifting in a chaos where nothing is sacred. Yes, the abyss is real, but it is not final. Darkness may dominate the moment, yet it is never the final chapter. However deep the abyss, there remains the possibility, even the inevitability, of ascent for those who choose it. At every moment, human beings face a choice. This is the timeless truth that echoes through all history and scripture, the choice between descent and ascent, between destruction and redemption. No generation is fated to fall forever. At any point we can turn and step upward. We can remain in free fall, surrendering to the chaos and corruption that beckon us downward. Or we can arrest our descent, gather our will, and begin the hard climb toward meaning and moral renewal. The abyss, or the ascent, lies before us. Each of us, individually and as a culture, must decide on which path we walk. Will we continue to spiral into confusion and despair, or will we rise and seek light and life again? This perennial question now confronts us with renewed urgency. Where shall we find the strength and guidance for this ascent? One powerful place to begin is the Bible, that ancient wellspring of wisdom which has anchored troubled souls for millennia. In its pages we rediscover a cosmos ordered by meaning and truth. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, that you and your offspring may live, says the biblical voice. In an age unmoored by relativism, such words resound like a clear trumpet call. The Bible reminds us that we are not orphans cast into a void. We are bearers of divine image, participants in a moral universe, capable of choosing truth over lies and love over hate. Its narratives and teachings restore context and coherence, the sense that our lives are part of something larger, guided by eternal principles of justice, mercy, and purpose. Yet this invitation to turn toward the light is not confined to one tradition. The door is open to all who seek genuine truth. Whether one begins with the Bible or walks another honorable path of wisdom, the essential journey is the same, to rediscover moral, spiritual, and metaphysical grounding. Some may find guidance in philosophy, or in the examples of saints and sages from other faiths. Others in the quiet whisper of conscience or the beauty of the natural world. All these paths, if earnest, lead upward. What matters is the turning of the heart, the sincere rejection of the lie that life is empty and insignificant, and the bold affirmation that there is order to be followed, truth to be found, and a higher good to serve. We do not close the door to anyone willing to climb. The ascent welcomes every soul that hungers for the real and the sacred. To choose blessing over curse means, in practical terms, to live consciously and courageously even amid the chaos. It means deciding, here and now, to live meaningfully in a culture drunk on meaninglessness, to live ethically in a time of moral confusion, and to live courageously where cynicism and despair hang like smog. The curse before us is a life spent in thrall to false idols, whether of consumerism, ideological fanaticism, or soul-deadening nihilism. A life that ultimately leads to spiritual death. The blessing, by contrast, is a life aligned with what is true and good. A life of integrity, love, and purpose that affirms creation rather than destroying it. Every choice we make, however small, nudges us one way or the other, toward the curse of further corruption, or toward the blessing of renewal. There is no neutral ground. In a broken era, simply to stand for what is good is a heroic act of choosing the blessing. So let this closing invocation be both challenge and comfort. The crisis is real, but so is our capacity to overcome it. The responsibility now rests with us, with you who hold this book and have walked with us through the darkness. We are called to a sacred responsibility, to reject the lie that we are powerless, and instead to claim our power to live in truth. We are summoned to hope, not a naive hope that pretends everything is fine, but a hard-won hope born of confronting evil and still asserting that good will prevail. And we are charged with sacred action, to rebuild what has been broken, to tend the small fires of faith and meaning in our homes and communities, and to carry the light forward. This duty cannot be outsourced or postponed. Each of us must decide to rise. In the end, from abyss to ascent is a choice. It is the choice before every generation and every person, the choice between the curse of surrender and the blessing of struggle, between the darkness of meaninglessness and the light of purpose. Let us choose rightly. Let us choose life over death, hope over despair, love over apathy. Let us embrace our freedom to seek the good and affirm the sacred. As we close this journey of critique and reflection, A new journey begins, the journey upward. May we go forward with resolve to choose the blessing over the curse, to lift ourselves and those we love from the abyss toward the dawn of renewal. In this choice lies our future. In this choice, God willing, lies our salvation. Appendices. Glossary of eschatological and psychological terms. Thanatos, death instinct. In Greek mythology, Thanatos is the personification of death. In psychoanalytic theory, the term signifies an unconscious drive toward death and destruction, often linked to aggression and self-destructive behavior. Within the book's context of youth nihilism, Thanatos symbolizes the lure of self-annihilation and violence that can captivate disaffected young minds. Eros, life instinct. In contrast to Thanatos, Eros denotes the life drive, the impulse toward survival, love, creativity, and vitality. Freud identified Eros as the force that promotes survival, reproduction, and social cooperation, balancing the destructive pull of Thanatos. Metaphysically, Eros is akin to a life-affirming energy or love that can counter nihilistic despair by inspiring connection, creativity, and hope. And logos, a Greek term meaning word. Logos in ancient philosophy and Christian theology refers to the divine reason implicit in the cosmos, the ordering principle that gives life form and meaning. It is associated with truth, rationality, and the Word of God. In this book's themes, logos represents the presence of a higher moral or spiritual order, the voice of truth and reason that can guide youths out of chaos and relativism toward purpose. Death drive, Todestrieb. In Freudian theory, the death drive is the drive toward death and destruction, often expressed through behaviors such as aggression, repetition compulsion, and self-destructiveness. Freud proposed that alongside Eros, the life drive, there exists this counter-drive pushing individuals toward dissolution or a return to an inorganic state. The book uses the death drive concept to explain nihilistic impulses in youth culture. For example, fascination with violence, suicidal ideation, or the urge to burn it all down as manifestations of an unconscious death wish. Eschaton. From the Greek eschaton, last or ultimate, the eschaton refers to the final event in the divine plan or the end of the world in theological discourse. In eschatology, the study of last things, it encompasses apocalyptic expectations of a climax of history, for example, Judgment Day or the Second Coming. The book's metaphysical outlook invokes the eschaton when discussing how apocalyptic fantasies or end times despair, a sense that society is in its final degeneration, can influence youth psychology, either fueling nihilism or conversely inspiring a search for renewal before the end. Narcissistic wounding, sometimes called narcissistic injury. This term describes an emotional trauma that shatters a person's self-esteem and ego defenses. A narcissistic wound often occurs when one's self-image or sense of significance is deeply threatened. For example, by humiliation, rejection, or failure, leading to feelings of shame and rage. In the context of youth corruption, narcissistic wounding might refer to the injured pride of a generation told they are special yet confronted with a stark, competitive world. Such wounds can breed resentment, withdrawal into fantasy, or extremist attitudes as compensatory mechanisms for hurt egos. Symbolic order. In psychoanalytic and philosophical terms, the symbolic order is the structured realm of language, culture, law, and shared meanings that human beings inhabit. It is essentially a language-mediated order of culture that superimposes the kingdom of culture on that of nature. The symbolic order, a concept developed by Lacan, provides the framework of values, norms, and symbols through which individuals find identity and make sense of reality. When the symbolic order is intact, it offers a stable logos or structure, for example, religious narratives, moral law, national identity that guides youth. When it collapses or is corrupted, as in periods of moral confusion or social breakdown, young people may experience existential disorientation, contributing to nihilism. Re-establishing a healthy symbolic order is thus key to cultural renewal in the book's vision. Historical case studies. ISIS recruitment. Sexual and apocalyptic lures. The militant group ISIS provides a contemporary case of youth radicalization using eschatological and sexual motifs. ISIS propaganda explicitly invoked apocalyptic narratives. Recruiters pitched that fighters were key agents in the imminent end of days, with apocalyptic fantasies being a major part of the Islamic State's recruiting pitch. Young volunteers were enticed by the idea that the final battles between good and evil were approaching, giving cosmic meaning to their struggle. Alongside this eschatological zeal, ISIS exploited sexual incentives. Recruits were frequently promised transcendental carnal rewards. One fighter recounts being told that martyrs would enjoy 72 eternal virgins in heaven, and even that captive women on earth could be taken as wives by holy warriors. Such promises were not just idle talk. ISIS openly justified sexual slavery of non-Muslim women as part of its apocalyptic mission. By offering both an erotic outlet and a grand sense of purpose, ISIS tapped into profound drives, Thanatos and Eros gone perverse, to draw alienated youth. This case study illustrates how a death cult can weaponize the promise of paradise, mixing lust, death, and destiny, to corrupt the young and turn nihilistic despair into fanaticism. And sex death cults, Manson family and Heaven's Gate. The 20th century offers stark examples of cults that intertwine sexual deviancy and obsession with death. One infamous case is the Manson family, led by Charles Manson in the late 1960s. Manson's cult began as a hippie commune indulging in free love and LSD, but he twisted this freedom into a tool of control and violence. Manson himself engaged in group sex with his family members to cement his charismatic hold, then redirected his followers' energy toward an apocalyptic mission. He prophesied a coming race war, which he called Helter Skelter after a Beatles song, and believed that by committing shocking murders, they could ignite this end-of-days scenario. In August 1969, Manson's devotees brutally killed 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate, acts carried out to move along the imagined apocalypse. Manson taught his followers to see secret meanings in music and convinced them that the violence was necessary for a new world. He envisioned that after the chaos, he and his cult would emerge from hiding to rule the ruins of Los Angeles. Here, unfettered eros, in the form of drug-fueled sex and wild idealism, was perverted into Thanatos ritualistic murder under an eschatological delusion. Another example is the Heaven's Gate cult. In March 1997, 39 members of this group died in a coordinated mass suicide, an event Heaven's Gate had long prepared for as the culmination of their beliefs. Led by Marshall Applewhite, the cult combined sci-fi apocalypticism with extreme asceticism. They taught that the material world was to be renounced entirely in order to reach a higher plane. Sexuality was strictly forbidden. In fact, Applewhite advocated sexual abstinence, and several male cult members even underwent castration in pursuit of purity. The cult believed that a spacecraft, traveling behind the Hale-Bopp comet, would transport their souls to a new kingdom. But to board this heavenly vessel, they had to leave their human bodies' containers behind through death. In this tragic finale, adherents voluntarily drank poison to free their spirits, in hope of cosmic salvation. Heaven's Gate thus epitomizes a death cult in which Eros was utterly repressed to the point of physical neutering, and death was embraced as the gateway to transcendence. Both the Manson family and Heaven's Gate show how charismatic leaders confuse erotic manipulation and death obsession to create nihilistic cults. Whether via orgiastic violence or suicidal puritanism, the end result is the same. Individuals surrender their moral agency to a corrupt vision that glorifies death as the solution to life's problems. Modern psychology, pornography, online radicalization, and emotional dysregulation. Contemporary research sheds light on factors corrupting youth in less overtly dramatic but widespread ways. Pornography has become ubiquitous in the digital age, and studies indicate it can seriously distort young people's psychology. Excessive internet porn consumption provides artificial stimuli disconnected from real relationships, which can lead to abnormal emotional responses and addiction-like behaviors. Many adolescents report that compulsive porn use numbs their ability to feel pleasure and may aggravate feelings of depression and loneliness. In parallel, experts have observed a worrying link between online media and radicalization. Unlike past generations, today's youth are bombarded with extremist content. Whenever they go online, it's impossible not to encounter propaganda and hate in some form. Terrorist recruiters and ideologues actively target disaffected young users in forums, video games, and social media, tailoring messages to exploit personal grievances. Emotional vulnerabilities such as trauma, social isolation, or feelings of confusion and anger markedly increase a young person's susceptibility to radical messages. In effect, the internet can act as a giant funnel, channeling private pain or rage into extreme ideologies, a modern pathway to Thanatos in which a youth's inward nihilism finds an outlet in outward violence or fanatic belief. Lastly, psychologists highlight emotional dysregulation as both a cause and consequence of youth corruption. Constant digital stimulation and dopamine-driven apps rob young people of practicing self-soothing and focus. Even in early childhood, if kids are always calmed with a tablet or phone, they fail to develop their own coping mechanisms. Indeed, frequent use of devices to pacify children is associated with increased emotional dysregulation over time. By adolescence, this manifests as anxiety, impulsivity, and an inability to tolerate discomfort. Many teens retreat further into digital worlds, or quick highs, pornography, video games, extremist echo chambers, to escape stress, only to further impair their real-life emotional skills. The result is a cycle of dysregulation and escapism. Attention spans shorten, empathy dulls, and nihilism can take root as genuine social and spiritual fulfillment grows more elusive. These modern studies underline the book's central warning that a culture of instant gratification, hypersexualization, and online tribalism is warping the psyche of the young, requiring deliberate intervention for healing and renewal. Recommended readings and media: Detox Plan. Foundational spiritual and philosophical texts to counter nihilism and inspire cultural renewal. Immersing oneself in enduring works of wisdom is essential. The following readings are recommended as a mental and spiritual reset, offering perspective and truth that have guided souls through crises for centuries. The Bible, the Holy Bible, with emphasis on books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Gospels, provides a wellspring of spiritual insight. Its narratives and teachings confront the full spectrum of human experience, meaning and despair, morality, sacrifice, redemption. For a youth adrift, the Bible's wisdom literature acknowledges the vanity of worldly pursuits, echoing modern nihilism, while the New Testament offers a path to hope, love, and transcendent purpose. In St. Augustine's Confessions, in this 4th-century autobiography, St. Augustine chronicles his journey from hedonistic youth to devout Christian bishop. Confessions is profoundly relevant to themes of corruption and renewal. Augustine indulged in sensual pleasures and manic ambition, only to find them empty. His candid reflections on restlessness, "Our heart is restless until it rests in thee," and conversion illustrate how grace and truth can heal a nihilistic soul. This classic work bridges psychological insight and spiritual depth, showing a way out of the death drive of sin into a life of meaning. And Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt analyzes the 20th century's descent into totalitarian hatred, Nazism, Stalinism, offering lessons about how nihilism and cynicism in society can enable great evil. Arendt dissects how the breakdown of social bonds and truth paved the way for ideological fanaticism. Reading her work helps one recognize the importance of preserving a humane symbolic order, shared truth, human dignity, and responsibility, lest youthful disillusionment be exploited by demagogues. Her insights into the banality of evil also teach that thoughtlessness and moral emptiness can be as dangerous as overt malice. And C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. In this brief but potent 1943 treatise, C.S. Lewis warns of the consequences of relativism and the loss of objective values. He famously observes that modern educators make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise, meaning we strip young people of heart and moral vision. The chest, seat of emotions and magnanimity, yet still demand moral excellence from them. Lewis's critique of a culture that laughs at honor and then is shocked by corruption is uncannily relevant today. The Abolition of Man calls for a return to universal truths and natural law, making the case that real progress and renewal require a grounding in what is objectively good and true. Byung-Chul Han, The Burnout Society. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han offers a concise analysis of late modern culture's pathologies. In The Burnout Society 2010, he describes how the pressure to become a self-optimizing, hyper-efficient individual leads paradoxically to depression, anxiety, and collective burnout. Han argues that a society of compulsive positivity and productivity ends up with individuals who are exhausted, isolated, and stripped of contemplation. A spiritual emptiness behind material success. This diagnosis resonates with the emotional dysregulation and aimlessness afflicting many youth. Han's work implicitly calls for recovering inactivity and soulfulness, Sabbath rest, genuine community and focus, as antidotes to the fatigue of incessant digital capitalism. Additional classics. Depending on the reader's inclination, other works like Fyodor Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Probing Faith versus Nihilism, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Finding Purpose Amid Suffering, or T.S. Eliot's choruses from the Rock poetic critique of modern alienation, can further enrich one's journey to understanding and hope. The key is to engage with writings that have stood the test of time and speak to the deeper longings of the human spirit. Addendum. Unveiling the veil of lies through a spiritual lens, the veil of falsehood and the loss of truth. In recasting the critique of modern youth's corruption through a spiritual lens, we must first confront the metaphysical weight of falsehood. Lies are not mere individual misstatements, but spiritual poisons that penetrate the fabric of one's being. A lie operates as a veil across the mind's eye, alienating the soul from reality and obscuring the light of truth. In spiritual terms, every accepted falsehood is a step into darkness, a cataract over the intellect that impairs one's vision of the real. The harm of such lies is twofold, physical and spiritual. A physical lie, a deceit about worldly facts, can mislead actions and relationships, but a spiritual lie, a deceit about ultimate truths, morality, or one's purpose, strikes at the soul's orientation. It disorders our very perception of good and evil, warping conscience and character. Indeed, they are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. Just as a diseased body may perish, a spiritual sickness brought on by living in falsehood can endure and deepen, with consequences extending into eternity. In short, to live in lies is to dwell in unreality, an interior exile from the illumination of truth. Lies have a profound metaphysical impact. They sever the innate link between the intellect and reality, or between the soul and God, the source of all truth. When a young person embraces a lie, be it an ideological falsehood or a debased view of sexuality, something in the order of their being is disturbed. Truth is fundamentally aligned with being with what is, while falsehood aligns with non-being or illusion. Thus, every lie, no matter how mundane, participates in negation. It negates truth and thereby distances the soul from the ground of reality. Spiritual traditions have long warned that persisting in falsehood darkens the inner light. In Christian scripture, the devil is called the father of lies, John 8:44, and the god of this world who has blinded the minds of people. These images teach that falsehoods are instruments of spiritual blindness, used by forces of darkness to keep souls from perceiving the light. When untruth is absorbed into one's worldview, it shapes everything one sees. The lie becomes a lens coloring reality, eventually masquerading as truth itself. In this way, evil can even appear as an angel of light. In other words, the lie disguises itself so well that the person mistakes their blindness for sight. Consider the modern youth steeped in ideological propaganda or incessant sensual stimuli. Many do not know they are deceived. They even take pride in their supposed knowledge or liberation. Yet, under the spiritual lens, one perceives that their condition is akin to prisoners in Plato's cave, mistaking shadows for real objects. Ensnared by comforting illusions, they may vehemently defend what is false, having never seen the genuine light. The metaphysical effect of living under lies is an alienation from truth so deep that the mind, created to recognize truth, becomes estranged from its own purpose. The person's very capacity for discernment, the spiritual faculty by which we apprehend truth, grows dull and inert. Truth itself begins to appear unreal or offensive. As one priest analogized, when we dwell in a dark room for too long and then step into sunlight, our eyes hurt and we find the light obnoxious. Though the problem lies not in the light, but in our accustomed darkness. So too, the youth raised in falsehood find sincere truth-telling abrasive. Unless they gradually reacclimate to reality, they will prefer to retreat back into comforting shadows. In this tragic way, lies can imprison a soul, making the liberating light of truth appear as painful darkness. Such is the metaphysical calamity of falsehood. It calls darkness light and light darkness, deranging the compass of the spirit. Indoctrination and the imprinted framework. How do these lies take root so deeply, especially in the young? Here we confront the power of indoctrination, whether ideological brainwashing or indulgence in sensual temptations, to install predefined frameworks in the psyche without true understanding. Indoctrination is more than education. It is a form of conditioning that bypasses or short-circuits the individual's critical intelligence. One scholar defined indoctrination as a special state of the human psyche in which the non-critical appropriation of other people's ideas or doctrines is realized. In plainer terms, it means absorbing ideas without questioning, accepting a worldview's framework ready-made. These implanted frameworks act like mental filters. Before a young person can even reason on a matter, the framework provided by their indoctrination already decides how they interpret it. An ideologically indoctrinated youth, for example, might automatically see traditional moral truths as oppressive or outdated because their mind has been preloaded with certain assumptions. Likewise, a youth indoctrinated by a hypersexualized culture will view chastity or self-restraint as repression, having been conditioned to equate freedom with unrestrained sensual indulgence. All this can happen without the youth ever consciously understanding why they hold these reactions. The programming runs silently in the background of their psyche. The sensual form of indoctrination is particularly insidious. While we often think of indoctrination in terms of political or ideological brainwashing, there is also a sensory indoctrination prevalent in modern culture. Through constant exposure to sexual imagery, instant gratification, and pleasure-centric values, young people's desires are trained to respond in preset ways. They come to crave certain stimuli, and to see the world through the prism of pleasure and ego. This erotic conditioning embeds a framework in which personal desire is the ultimate guide, a ready-made philosophy of life absorbed without reflection. In both the ideological and the sensual forms, indoctrination works by repetition, emotional manipulation, and isolation from alternatives. As one analysis of cults notes, such methods create non-critical adoption of group doctrines, forging a tight identification with the indoctrinating group or culture. The result is a unified but unfree mind. Unified because the person's thoughts, values, and reactions all align with the indoctrinated framework, but unfree because genuine understanding and individual discernment have been supplanted by programmed responses. Indoctrination provides answers without questions, conclusions without inquiry, conviction without comprehension. It installs certainties that the person has never truly made their own through insight, effectively borrowing someone else's eyes to see. But those borrowed eyes may be blind. In spiritual perspective, indoctrination is a perversion of true learning. True education is meant to draw out the latent understanding and lead a soul to truth. Indoctrination instead presses in a false truth from outside, imprinting the soul with alien ideas. It can be viewed as a form of violence against the mind, a coercion that happens subtly, often under the guise of enlightenment or empowerment. Thus, many youths today wear their ideological slogans or sexual libertinism as if it were their own identity, not realizing they are echoing voices not their own. The tragedy is that such a person believes they understand since the framework is ingrained so deeply it feels natural, yet in reality, they might only understand catchphrases or surface rationalizations. The framework acts as armor against real insight. When genuine truth or contrary evidence comes along, the preset indoctrinated reactions deflect it automatically. In this way, indoctrination fosters a closed-minded certainty, difficult to penetrate. As Jesus said of religious leaders of his time, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear. Their hearts had been hardened by indoctrinated traditions, such that the living truth standing before them, Christ, was rejected. Likewise, an ideologically corrupted youth may reject truth unseen because their internal schema will not allow it to register. The person becomes, in effect, a follower of a script written by others, unable to access the depth of understanding that comes from their own spirit. Indoctrination tricks the soul. It offers ready knowledge that is in fact misknowledge, occupying the throne where authentic knowing born of experience, reason, and spiritual insight should sit. In summary, indoctrination installs a lie as the lens of perception, leaving the person to walk through life in a mental simulation, not engaging reality directly, but through a clouded glass, the eclipse of intelligence and the fettering of the spirit. If indoctrination is the external installation of the lie, there is also an internal factor in spiritual blindness, the eclipse of the intelligence by disordered forces within. Here we speak of intelligence not just as raw IQ or data processing, but as the spiritual faculty of discernment, what some traditions call the nous or the eye of the soul. True intelligence, in this higher sense, is the ability of the mind to perceive truth, to recognize the real distinction between right and wrong, reality and illusion. Tragically, this faculty can be impaired or suppressed by various inner maladies, internal conflict, disordered desires, or even a kind of spiritual infection. These forces act like clouds passing before the sun of the intellect, obscuring its light. Internal conflict, for example, a psyche torn by guilt, trauma, or cognitive dissonance, can absorb so much psychic energy that little is left for clear perception. A young person who is inwardly divided may unconsciously prefer comforting lies over painful truths, because their soul is already burdened. The lie then finds a ready home in their unresolved conflicts, telling them what they want to hear. Their intelligence, meant to arbitrate calmly, is drowned out by the clamor of inner turmoil. Even more potent are the disordered desires, what classical theology calls passions, or what Buddhism calls kleshas, the afflictive emotions. When the appetite or emotion runs rampant, it captivates the mind and steers it off course. Lust, greed, pride, envy, fear. These passions can become so strong that they effectively hijack the reasoning process. As one Buddhist text puts it, such passions are mental states that cloud the mind and manifest in unwholesome actions. They are like poisons that intoxicate the intellect. A person in the grip of lust or anger, for instance, often cannot see clearly. Their desire or rage paints reality in false colors. Modern neuroscience and psychology echo this insight strong. Emotions can bias perception and even memory. The ancients described it poetically. The passionate soul is like a chariot with wild horses, where reason the charioteer is dragged wherever the unruly steeds the passions run. Intoxication is a fitting metaphor, not only literally as in drunkenness but figuratively. Any overpowering desire makes one act like an animal because they've darkened their intellect and weakened their will. In such a state, the higher intelligence that discerns truth is eclipsed by the lower impulses. The philosopher Schopenhauer once observed that as soon as the sexual drive awakens strongly, it tends to undermine the intellect's higher aspirations. This corresponds to everyday experience. A youth preoccupied with lust or enslaved to appetite often loses sharpness of mind and moral clarity. Their spiritual intelligence, which should judge the passions, instead becomes a servant rationalizing the passions. Sin hardens the heart and darkens the intellect, as one commentator succinctly noted. The more one feeds disordered desires, the more the mind's eye loses its focus, growing gradually dim. By spiritual infection, we refer to the way falsehood and evil can take on a life within, acting almost like a parasitic presence. Repeated indulgence in lies or vice can invite a kind of spiritual pathogen. This need not be understood in a fantastical sense. It can be as simple as the formation of a habitual vice or false identity that seems to operate on its own. For example, a youth who habitually lies eventually reaches a point where telling the truth doesn't even occur to him. The lying habit speaks for him. In religious terms, one might say a demonic influence, or oppressive spirit has attached to the soul. In psychological terms, one might speak of a compulsion or deep-seated complex. However we frame it, the effect is that the person's agency and clarity are compromised. There is something within that pushes the soul away from truth and light. Such an individual might even experience truth as threatening to their very self, because their false identity built on the lie feels it must fight for survival. They become defensive and hostile when confronted with reality, as if allergic to it. This is a true spiritual malady. The lie has not only been believed, it has embedded itself in the person's nature, almost like an infection of the spirit. In some spiritual literature, this is called the presence of the demonic lie, or the parasite of sin, an ingrained falsehood that warps the person from the inside. The cumulative result of these impairments, conflict, passions, infection, is that intelligence, the beacon of the soul, is dimmed. The person loses the capacity to discern even when the truth is right before them. As Christ said of the morally corrupt leaders, "Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear?" It is a condition of being willfully blind. At some level, the truth is available, but the inner faculties to embrace it are weakened or suppressed. People in this state may act against their true benefit without knowing, or support destructive ideologies without grasping their error. The spiritual faculty of discernment, meant to be the lamp of the body, has gone dark, and if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Matthew 6:23, acting in spiritual blindness. They know not what they do. One of the most sobering aspects of this analysis is coming to realize that many people act without true knowledge of what they do. The modern world is full of individuals, especially some youth, who commit grave errors or even evils sincerely, under the impression that they are doing good or at least doing nothing wrong. How is this possible? Because the lie has been so deeply embedded in their worldview or nature, that they operate in a state of spiritual blindness. They quite literally know not what they do. Their sight is eclipsed, their map of reality distorted, so the normal feedback that conscience or reason would provide is absent. This phenomenon can be observed in both the ideological fanatic and the moral libertine. The ideological fanatic. Say, a young extremist indoctrinated into a radical political or social doctrine may commit acts of cruelty or injustice, convinced that they are righteous or necessary according to the false good they've been taught. Likewise, the libertine youth who has embraced a lifestyle of hedonism and self-indulgence may genuinely believe they are just following nature or being free, unaware that they are actually chaining themselves to lower impulses. In both cases, from a spiritual perspective, the person's inner eyes have been blinded. It is possible to be culpable, and yet not fully comprehend one's own culpability, a paradox recognized by spiritual teachers who urge compassion for sinners because many are in ignorance. Christ's plea from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," reflects this reality. Those who crucified the innocent did so under the power of a lie, in spiritual blindness. We see this blindness in how people can call evil good and good evil without malice, simply because they cannot tell the difference. In our times, certain behaviors or ideologies that corrupt the soul have been normalized and even legalized. Many youths accept them as good, or at least as acceptable, having never known the true good that these counterfeits distort. As one observer lamented of a confused generation, evil was being called good, and good was being called evil by the culture. Everything seemed upside down. When a lie is collectively accepted, it creates a cultural blindness on top of the personal blindness. The blind lead the blind. Leaders and influencers who themselves are spiritually blind, yet perhaps charismatic and confident, become guides for the younger generation, and, when the blind lead the blind, they shall all fall into a ditch. Both teacher and student, parent and child, tumble into error together, each reinforcing the other's delusions. This is how entire societies can become enchanted by lies, stumbling toward disaster all while believing they are on the right path. Spiritual blindness affects one's sense of legality, morality, and perception in subtle but profound ways. Legally, a person in darkness might lobby for unjust laws thinking them just, or exploit loopholes without remorse. Because their moral sight is skewed, they might even persecute the righteous under the false belief that they are protecting society, as happened to saints and prophets in history, driven out by people who sincerely thought them dangerous. Morally, the conscience of a spiritually blind person is misinformed. Either it's silent when it should speak excusing real wrongs, or it's loud when it should be quiet accusing them of imaginary offenses implanted by ideology. Their moral compass spins, because it is calibrated to a false north. And in everyday perception, spiritual blindness means one interprets experiences and intentions falsely. For instance, correction from a friend might be seen as attack, or exploitation by a manipulator might be seen as love, depending on the lies one believes about oneself and others. What makes this blindness especially hard to remedy is that the lie masks itself as truth. The illness convinces the patient that he is well. We touched already on how the devil disguises himself as an angel of light. That is, evil often presents itself as something good or at least neutral. In practical terms, a false ideology will usually contain some elements of truth or some appealing ideals, which act as the sugar coating for the poison. A life of vice often presents itself as a life of joy and freedom, until the bondage is too deep to ignore. Thus, the semblance of truth hides the inner lie. The youth operating in spiritual blindness might exude confidence in their worldview, might express authenticity and personal conviction, signs one would normally associate with truthfulness, and yet be completely ensnared by falsehood. Because the lie has worn the mask of truth for so long in their vision, they no longer recognize it as a mask at all. For example, consider how certain destructive behaviors are celebrated under the banner of identity or rights. The individuals sincerely believe they are affirming something true about themselves, when in reality they might be harming themselves based on a deceitful ideology of what the self is. But to them and to many onlookers, the lie looks identical to truth. Only by its fruits, suffering, emptiness, confusion, might one eventually tell something was false. Legally and socially, this masked lie can institutionalize spiritual blindness. Entire laws might be passed that enshrine a falsehood as normative, and those who see the falsehood are marginalized as though they were crazy or blind. morality can become inverted, compassion is urged for what is actually harmful, while genuine virtue is denounced as cruelty or intolerance. And because these changes often happen gradually, people acclimate to them without noticing, like the proverbial frog in boiling water. The lie's camouflage is its greatest weapon. By hiding in the garments of common sense or compassion or progress, it avoids detection. Those under its influence operate with what we might call false knowledge. They think they know, think they see clearly, but their knowledge is knowledge falsely so-called. In spiritual terms, they lack gnosis, true knowing, having settled for doxa, mere opinion or appearance. To an awake soul, the behavior of the spiritually blind can appear baffling. How can they not see what they are doing? How can they justify that? The answer is that the lie within provides its own justifications. The mind under a lie becomes fertile ground for rationalizations that explain away contradictions. We must remember to have a degree of compassion, even as we condemn the evil. Many of these individuals would not knowingly choose evil, but because evil has convincingly masqueraded as good in their eyes, they choose it without awareness. They are like people under a spell. In theological terms, they are slaves of sin, which promises them freedom. In psychological terms, they are victims of mass delusion or subliminal conditioning. They live tragically, as if in a dream, their noble faculties of reason and spirit, lulled into complacency by the ever-present lie. Piercing the mask toward awakening and illumination. The spiritual reading of this corruption, while sobering, is ultimately illuminating. It suggests that the fight against the ideological and sexual corruption of youth is not merely a cultural or political battle, but a spiritual war for the souls and sight of the young. The preceding sections have painted a dire picture, a veil of lies, deeply embedded frameworks, and eclipsed intelligence, and entire lives lived in blindness. But an addendum such as this would be incomplete if it did not also shine a light on the path out of this darkness. After all, to analyze spiritual blindness implies a hope for spiritual awakening, the lifting of the veil and the restoration of sight. First, it must be emphasized that truth itself has a metaphysical power. However obscured, reality remains real. A lie, no matter how pervasive, cannot fully erase the truth, it can only obscure it. This means that the foundation for healing is always present. The divine light, whether one conceives it as God, the good, the Dharma, or simply the integrity of reality, continues to shine. As the Gospel of John says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." No amount of falsehood can extinguish the source of truth. Therefore, even in a youth thoroughly corrupted by modern vices, there remains the capacity to recognize truth once it is unveiled. The imago Dei, divine image in the soul, can be dimmed but never destroyed. If one can peel back the layers of lies, the innate hunger for truth can reassert itself. What then can pierce the mask of lies? The process often requires a combination of grace and struggle. Intellectually, it means encouraging critical thinking and authentic education rather than indoctrination. Essentially teaching the youth how to think, not what to think. Morally, it means fostering virtue and self-discipline, so that disordered desires do not rule the mind, reclaiming the charioteer's control over the horses. Spiritually, it may involve prayer, contemplation, or sincere self-examination that invites a higher light to flood the dark corners of the heart. For those in the depths of blindness, sometimes only a profound shock can awaken them. Some encounter with suffering or beauty or mystery that the lie cannot fully explain away, thus cracking the edifice of false certainty. Indeed, suffering often serves as a bitter medicine to cure the soul's delusion, as the Church Fathers taught. While we would not wish suffering on anyone, in God's providence, even the painful consequences of sin can become the turning point that sobers a person from the inebriation of lies. On a societal level, witnessing to the truth becomes crucial. Those who still see must, with compassion and courage, speak truth to the blind, even at the risk of being mocked or persecuted. Over time, consistent witness can chip away at the cultural lies. History is full of movements where a small light kindled in great darkness eventually spread, whether we think of the early Christians in a decadent Rome, or reformers challenging corrupt institutions, or even whistleblowers exposing comfortable lies in our era. The key is a steadfast refusal to capitulate to the lie. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who fought the lies of totalitarian ideology, wrote in his essay Live Not by Lies, The primary way to resist a ubiquitous lie is simply not to participate in it. One may feel powerless against a giant system of falsehood, but one can always choose personally not to speak or endorse untruths, and that itself is a powerful spiritual stance. Let their rule hold not through me. In other words, each individual soul that commits to truth becomes a node of light pushing back against the darkness. By living in truth, we start to dissipate the collective illusion. For the youth corrupted in our times, the message of this spiritual addendum is ultimately one of hope and clarification. It calls them, and all of us, to recognize the metaphysical stakes of seemingly small choices between truth and lies. Every truthful act is a step further into reality, and hence into freedom. Every lie, however convenient, is a step deeper into bondage. It reminds us that intelligence, the true intelligence, is a sacred gift that must be guarded and cultivated. It is the lamp of God within us, meant to shine brightly, but it requires cleaning through virtue and honest inquiry, lest it grow dim. If it has been dimmed, it can be cleaned and relit. Conscience can be reawakened. Minds can be renewed. The very fact we speak of blindness implies the concept of vision, which can be restored. In Christian theology, conversion metanoia is precisely this, a turning from darkness to light, a scales falling from the eyes moment, after which one walks as a child of light, Ephesians 5:8. Other spiritual traditions likewise have concepts of enlightenment, awakening, or liberation, all conveying the removal of ignorance and the dawning of true sight. In practical reflection, this means we must treat the corruption of youth not only with outrage, but with understanding and mercy. We fight the lies tirelessly, and we labor to heal the victims of the lies. The addendum reframes the battle. Our enemy is not ultimately the youth who parrot absurdities or engage in depravity. They are captives to be freed. The real enemy is the lie itself, and the spiritual forces and systems that propagate it. In striving to save our young generation, we must combine spiritual discernment to unmask lies, with spiritual charity to guide the blind gently toward the light. Some will resist and stumble, like eyes adjusting to brightness. It's a process that can hurt at first. But we have faith that the light of truth once glimpsed is healing. As the Psalm says, "The Lord opens the eyes of the blind," and as Christ promised, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The ultimate goal of this spiritual interpretation is to invite that freedom, to see the corruption of modern youth not as a hopeless descent, but as a field for God's redemption. In exposing the metaphysical dimensions of the problem, we also uncover the path to a metaphysical solution, the reunion of the soul with truth, the dispersal of darkness by the luminous light that the darkness can never overcome. Outline of a spiritual reading of the book. To summarize and structure this spiritual lens on the book's message, below is a brief index of key themes and how each can be interpreted, and how this stifles genuine intellect and freedom. 3. Eclipse of the intellect, the impairment of the spiritual faculty of discernment, intelligence by internal disorder, conflicts, disordered passions, and spiritual infection, shows how sin and unchecked desire darken the intellect and distort judgment. The soul's eye grows dim, unable to see truth due to the shadows within. 4. Spiritual blindness, the state of acting under deeply embedded lies, in which individuals know not what they do. Describes how people can commit evil or remain in error sincerely because their worldview is veiled by falsehood. Draws on the concept of the blind leading the blind in society and the inversion of morality calling evil good that results. 5. Masquerading as light, analysis of how lies mask themselves as truth, deceiving the legal, moral, and perceptual faculties. Discusses the subtlety of evil appearing good, Satan as an angel of light, and how cultural lies gain legitimacy by mimicry of truth. Emphasizes the difficulty of discernment in such cases and the need for spiritual vigilance. Mastery over passions, and grace or enlightenment, divine or higher assistance to open the eyes, encourages living not by lies as a personal stand, and offers hope that through perseverance, truth will conquer falsehood, restoring sight to the blind and freedom to those once corrupted.